English translation 731st Contact. Part 1 Monday, the 3rd of February 2020, 21:58 hours.
Edward, dear friend, greetings.
Well, dear friend, greetings and welcome also to you. As we have discussed, today you want to carry out some things concerning the corona plague, which is more than just our normal conversations. However, I would like to say that it would be good if you could explain everything in simple terms so that I and all those who will later read our conversation when I have retrieved it and written it down, as medical laymen, can understand everything correctly.
You are not as amateurish as you pretend to be, my friend, just as others will not be either. But you will still be right, because the majority of those who read the notes later will probably not be medically educated, so I will choose my explanations in such a way that everything will also be understood by them. Then I will begin in a simple explanatory manner as follows. Our research unit, which has been working since last year in late summer on the onset of the SARS epidemic, which is very far-reaching and will now be rampant worldwide as a corona epidemic pandemic, has so far produced frightening findings. This also includes the fact that the supreme leaders of all countries, as rulers of the people, are incapable of correctly assessing the epidemic, which has been spreading strongly and globally for some time. With a few exceptions who, however, cannot get through with their opinions. The people's superiors are also incapable of recognizing the correct protective measures, instructing them and having them carried out, which is to be laid at their door as the fault of the pandemic that has already started. But this will be denied and trivialized by them, as is usual with them, in order to evade their responsibility, as is the case with all arrogant earthly exercisers of state power. Our experts have established that this epidemic, of which you have spoken several times before and which is also recorded in written reports, will continue to spread rapidly worldwide in the near future and will intensify in its dangerousness and lethality, and consequently also claim many human lives. Note Bernadette Brand, Pleiadian Playaran Contact Reports, Volume 6, 230th Contact of 11.10. 1989, page 101. Volume 7, 251st Contact of 3.2. 1995, page 334, and Volume 9, 341st Contact of 2.4. 2003, page 6. The dangerousness and lethality of this insidious disease results from mutation, whereby changes and from them new gene variations of the virus arise, which become more dangerous and more attacking. Due to the changing dangerousness of the coronavirus, in the coming weeks, first older human beings, but also persons with a history of disease, will be infected, which will also lead to high mortality rates. For the time being, younger human beings, especially juveniles and children, are less susceptible to the coronavirus. Through its self-acting transformation, however, new gene variations will emerge that will become more dangerous and aggressive. Consequently, these will then also spread to younger human beings, infect them, and also claim victims. Furthermore, in the near future, a large number of human beings will be infected and die on a global scale, who, as a result of harmful blood mixtures between members of different tribes, will have negatively altered immune systems, of which the earthly immunologists, medical doctors, and virologists, etc., have no idea whatsoever. I will explain this for those persons who, on the one hand, will read the discussion notes and, on the other hand, have no knowledge in the subject of immunology of what the immune system is all about. According to the doctrine of immunology or immunobiology, the immune system is the basis of the body's defense against pathogens of a biological and biochemical nature. Basically, the immune system corresponds to a factor of organic self-defense in the form of defense against foreign substances attacking and invading the human, also other living beings, organism, such as biological toxins and environmental toxins, as well as bacteria, microbes, fungi, parasites, viruses, and other pathogens. All of these cause malfunctions and disorders in the body, against which the immune system uses defense mechanisms to fight the attacking foreign bodies, etc. The teaching of immunology or immunobiology, and thus of the immune system, corresponds as a research subject to a sub-discipline of biology, namely to a system of cellular and molecular processes that enable the recognition of various pathogens and foreign substances and the inactivation of these. The processes of this kind are to be understood as immune rejection. Due to its central role in relation to the human immune system, immunology is very important in medicine for the understanding of a multitude of diseases. The main focus is on prevention, which is always aimed at reducing risks or mitigating or preventing harmful consequences of any kind that could be detrimental to health and lead to catastrophes or other undesirable situations. Immunology has various subfields, with immunochemistry investigating the structure of antigens, antibodies, and the chemical basis of immune reactions. While immunogenetics studies the genetic variability of immune reactions or the mechanisms of generation of the antigen-presenting relationship regions of antibodies from thymus cell receptors, or T lymphocytes, which correspond to a group of white blood cells that serve the immune defense. These thymic lymphocytes, the cells mature in the thymus, together with the B lymphocytes represent the adaptive or acquired immune response. Finally, there is immunopathology and clinical immunology, which study disorders of the immune system, such as those related to allergies, autoimmune diseases, tumor formation, etc.
All well and good. Dear friend, your explanations are all well and good, but I suppose that your explanations are probably not understandable to lay people, even if you have explained them in an understandable way. But I think that further explanations are probably not necessary, because only a few Earthlings would certainly be interested in that. At least not those who have too few grits in their noggin to even want to think about the whole thing. Consequently, they are as dumb as beans.
Doubly bean stupid, for anything of this nature is of great importance to the preservation of health.
I know that, but you cannot force anyone to turn to reason and sanity if they do not want to do so themselves. The basic fact is that the majority of the Earth's population does not listen to anything and does not accept any truths, so that good, correct, and important advice is also thrown to the wind. If something is said, it is heard, but what is said is not heard.
This unfortunately corresponds to the fact, because the majority of Earth humans are so focused on themselves, on personal well-being and personal profit, as well as on all conceivable personal advantages and above all on a confused and insane delusion of God, that on the one hand, every personal logical thinking is effectively stifled, as you say in each case, but on the other hand also the grasping, forming, and use of understanding and reason is impossible. Now, however, I will go into the further necessary things that are still to be said. B. Atmospheric and climatic factors also contribute to the infection by the coronavirus, as does the transmission of the coronavirus, as well as airborne transmission. Although this does not mean that the air or atmosphere is contaminated with the pathogenic agent, but rather that it is only transmitted from human beings to human beings through the air in closed rooms and outdoors, depending on the direction of the wind, if there is too little distance between them. Therefore, it is important that in every relationship, and especially in conversation or communication, a sufficiently large distance of about 1.50 to 2 meters is maintained between one human being and another. This is because breath is emitted through breathing and speaking, and expiratory droplets are also excreted, which float through the air and, if the distance is insufficient, are inhaled by human beings facing each other, thereby infecting them. C. Expiratory droplets are not only inhaled by human beings facing each other if the distance between the interlocutors is too small, but they are also deposited on all possible parts of the body, especially on the face and hands, but also on clothing, on open meat of all kinds, which means that the pathogenic agent, like various other pathogenic agents, can easily settle on moist surfaces, remain there for some time, and have an infectious effect. Unharmed and uncut fruits and vegetables, on the other hand, can be washed and tasted well. This, while dead objects and materials of any kind in a completely dry state offer the pathogen little to no possibility of deposition, but possibly only if they are soaked. D, another factor for infection by the coronavirus, is that all genera and species of mammals are susceptible to this virus and can therefore be infected by it, whereby domestic animals such as dogs and cats in particular can contribute to the spread of the disease, but also all other mammals such as cattle, horses and pigs, as well as rodents, etc. The treatment of human beings infected with the corona disease requires that doctors and nursing staff only carry out their activities in fully protective clothing, and that this clothing must be changed for the next infected person to be treated. This is because the protective clothing is contaminated by moist respiratory exhalation or droplets of exhalation from patients affected by the epidemic, and is infectiously contaminated, and consequently the virus is inevitably transmitted to other persons, not only to patients, but also to doctors and nursing staff. 5. Our foresight findings indicate that infections with the corona epidemic will continue to increase worldwide, and that a new phase of increase is already taking place, which will also spread worldwide in waves over the next few months and claim many victims, and that no country will be spared. 6. The irrationality of the Earth humans, especially the leaders of the states, will lead to the fact that compatriots who are in other countries will be brought back home, whereby persons infected by the epidemic will spread the virus additionally and increasingly and very quickly in practically all countries. As a result, in countries where the epidemic is reduced, it is rekindled by new introductions and spread again. 7. Also due to the unreasonableness of the majority of the population, which will not change its consequently incorrect behavior and will not adhere to issued decrees regarding protective measures. The infections and deaths will continue to rise steadily, but this is also because all measures ordered by the authorities are ill-considered and extremely inadequate, and to a great extent insufficient. This is because the majority of both sexes of all those responsible in the state leadership are incapable of foresight, as well as being completely naive with regard to the danger and effect of the coronavirus, which genetically changes itself, as is also partly the case with virology experts. 8. Since the time of the SARS epidemic, virologists, etc., have been researching the Sars virus, which has so far led to certain valuable findings, but the whole thing has been approached far too laxly. Consequently, it is also not recognized that valuable substances have been gained through this valuable research and its results, which could be worked out in a relatively short time and used against the mutated coronavirus, which is independently changing into new gene variations. 9. Unreasonableness and incapacity prevail on the one hand among state leaders, state administrations, state officials, and authorities who are incapable of their positions and are neither able to think ahead nor to foresee logically, as is also the case among the population. All of them are incapable of assessing imminent events and situations that arise unexpectedly, and consequently they are also incapable of ordering the necessary measures, having them carried out and bringing the populations under control. Consequently, those in charge of the state and all its subgroups, up to the municipal authorities and security forces, etc., find it difficult, if not impossible, to ensure that the necessary measures are observed before a catastrophe develops, such as the corona epidemic pandemic, which started much earlier and caused deaths, and was already carried abroad before the epidemic was recognized on the 8th of December 2019, and only lax measures were taken against it. 10. The changes in the virus, which have been going on for a long time and will also continue to happen now and in the time to come, will not be recognized by the earthly researchers for quite some time, which will additionally lead to many infections and deaths. 11. Different peoples show different symptoms with regard to fever, cough, and cold, as well as other epidemic characteristics of which there are still others. Consequently, some will suffer more from one, others from other forms of symptoms. In this respect, in view of the different populations and strata of the population, there are also different forms of symptoms and negative immune susceptibilities, especially because there is no uniform immune system in the entire population of the Earth. But each people and each stratum of the population show hardly noticeable deviations from the norm, which is, however, decisive for the fact that the danger of infection is higher or lower, depending on the case. This fact, however, is still unknown to earthly doctors. Physicians, researchers, virologists, and immunologists, etc., as are very many other factors which they will still have to fathom for many years and with great difficulty. 12. The various immune systems or the biological defense system of the various peoples of Earth humans, as well as of all higher living beings, prevent tissue and organ damage caused by pathogens. But in this respect, and with regard to health-related behavior, etc., the populations are hardly or not at all taught or instructed by health professionals, as this would correspond to the necessity. With regard to this fact, the state leaders and authorities would also be called upon to take the necessary steps and actions throughout the country to educate the populations, which would also teach them how to behave fundamentally so that great evils can be avoided when an epidemic or other disaster strikes. 13. The above-mentioned fact of the differences of the immune systems among the Earth humans, respectively their peoples, groupings, clans, sexes, and mixtures of peoples, is not known to the earthly physicians. These differences, however, deserve special attention because they are very significant, for they are not only caused by the atmosphere, climate, and territory, but they also depend on social factors of behavior, etc. Therefore, they are a particularly strong contributor to corona infection and deaths in various countries. The atmospheric and climatic influences on the immune systems lead to particular viral gene changes in certain countries, which also result in different infection moments. Consequently, the ongoing virus gene-related changes also show different symptoms in the case of the corona epidemic. These are particularly pronounced in certain areas in countries of emigration as a result of the mixing of peoples. However, there is also a lot to be explained with regard to the pure variety, diversity of species, and the mixing of peoples, because these have a special value with regard to the resistance of the immune systems of Earth humans, which are weakened or strengthened as the case may be. 14. Earth humans consist of a single race and not of several races, as is generally assumed. Earth human being thus corresponds worldwide to a single species, which is called human being, but which is split up into various species and which are organically and structurally derived from each other, as well as from all the species spread worldwide, which correspond altogether to the genus Homodom, or human being. This means that they are assigned to a derivative or a basic substance, and thus to a parent compound that is chemically and organically related. This parent compound and its derivatives are structurally closely related to each other, as the definition accordingly makes clear. In this respect, the organic chemistry of a substance, because it has a structural unit, corresponds to a functional group of a parent compound and also contains a structural element of this functional group in the same oxidation state. If the functional group of the parent compound is considered, then a new functional group is found in the derivative as a species, but it possesses a structural sub-element of the functional group of the parent compound in the same oxidation state. And W.
Excuse me for interrupting, but this chemical stuff is probably not suitable for laymen to understand. I am also poorly educated in these matters. While I can understand where it is all leading to, my intelligentum, as a result of my lack of study, is not sufficient to be able to accurately define and make sense of all the processes involved.
That was not the point of my attempt to explain. Unfortunately, I fell into my learned knowledge and did not think about the fact that I have to give an explanation understandable to laymen.
It's all right. It was not an accusation. Just an interjection to point out to you that, seen by us laymen, you have lapsed into a talking shop that would probably ultimately have lapsed into forms of man-breeding and man-monoculture. At any rate, that is what I assume, because you spoke of a pure breed, a diversity of species and a mixing of peoples, whereas I actually understand pure breed or racial purity by your term pure breed. In this respect, I have learned from your father Schwath that a pure race as such brings both advantages and disadvantages, namely in terms of susceptibility to disease or immunity to disease. Accordingly, according to my understanding, as I learned it early in my life from Schwath, and if I may, according to your naming, call the pure genera a pure attitude and call it so. These can generally possess a good and stronger constitution, as well as, on the other hand, a less good one. And this is to be applied to physical, mental, and consciousness health, as well as to the fact that earthlings can be as dumb as beans or as intelligent beasts. I have also experienced and learned this in my life in my dealings with human beings of many purebloods. So these facts are known to me, and for me they are experienced and learned facts, which I have often also simply observed, but from which I have been able to learn a lot about earthlings. For me, however, there is no reason to assume that the negative aspect of the whole thing would be limited only to the rank and file and thus to the majority of the earthlings, because I have made my observations to a large extent also with academics and doctorate holders as well as with various big and well-known government leaders, up to state presidents, dictators, and also up to the Emperor of Persia. And of all people, I have usually found many deficits of character, action, understanding, reason, and behavior in them, which were much less or not at all present in the majority of the population. Well, I also know that a monopopulation or a reintroduction of a people can be harmful if no mixing with foreign immigrants takes place and no new blood is added, because the old blood in the immune system of a people leaches out, so to speak, and thus the human beings become more susceptible to disease and consequently less resistant to pests and malicious, bad and poisonous environmental influences. If, however, within an appropriate and controlled framework, a mixture of blood, etc., and precisely a mixture of peoples occurs, an indispensable mixed culture, so to speak, then this causes, depending on the case, either a higher and better, or conversely a lower and worse resistance. And this fact can be observed and recognized worldwide in all peoples, whereby this principle can be recognized and found not only in Earth humans, but in all living beings, because the transfer from one life form to another has a positive or negative effect in any case, so also in relation to the Earth human being species. As I learned from Schwath already as a young man, during visits that took me to various peoples all over the world, where I had the opportunity to learn these facts through his help in time travel. As it was also the case later during my own wanderings through the world, reincarnation is not good, and that from the very beginning. As I have found out, many valuable and positive, developmentally progressive innovations and evolutionary value complexes arise from a justified, controlled, and purposeful blood refreshment or mixing between members of different peoples. This, while wild, unjustified and uncontrolled machinations and processes of this kind give rise to development inhibiting or development disturbing and even development destroying factors, from which come discord, hatred, and all kinds of evil. And precisely this is, in my opinion, the reason why blood refreshment between peoples and thus the mixing of peoples should only take place within a controlled framework, but not through the mass immigration caused by globalization or through floods of refugees who, as a result of wars, hunger, unemployment, and terrorism, flood foreign countries and bring about blood mixtures with the natives in these countries either randomly and aimlessly or deliberately or forced by violence. Strictly speaking, I see all peoples with all their cultures as a special and gigantic organism that is constantly growing and developing, although each organism is different from every other. And if this were not so, then the whole world would look very bad and sink into monotony. Because if all human beings and their cultures were of the same kind, then no further development would take place, because the whole of humanity would be incapable of such development and would wither away as a result of the factor of monotony. This is precisely because in this pure-bloodedness or racial purity, no blood mixing or blood renewal would take place, and the result would be the atrophy of various forms, right up to the extinction of the peoples, as has already happened in earlier times and various peoples have died out. Therefore, for the preservation of the peoples, and of humanity as a whole, it is necessary that mixtures between members of the different peoples take place within a controlled framework in order to refresh the blood among each other, and thus to counteract a monopopulation or a pure breed or racial purity. And this is necessary because every nation as a whole, as well as every individual, must continue to develop, and for this purpose blood renewal or mixing between the peoples is also necessary. But if this does not come about, then there is nothing that can be supplemented and combined, because only a supplementing and merging of different factors that fit together can give rise to something new and bring forth something lasting. And it is precisely every newly created stable thing that forms an important factor for further development to take place and for permanence to be guaranteed. And this also refers to the continued existence of earthliness as a whole and in all its diversity. It is therefore completely mistaken to believe that a people must be biologically and culturally pure-blooded or pure-raced, for it is not possible to be pure-blooded or pure-raced. If this delusion arises, then a degenerative catastrophe is pre-programmed, as the history of mankind has proved since time immemorial and right up to the present day, when in the delusion of purity, the world has always been overrun with war, murder, plundering, and destruction, as also happened from 1939 to 1945 by the Nazi regime, but which is still happening today worldwide. For example, through terrorist organizations of all kinds, religion fanatic states and the like. In fact, earthly humanity must stop delusionally imagining itself as pure-blooded peoples and identifying itself as such pure-blooded peoples. Because in truth, there is not a single people on earth that is effectively pure-blooded. Because from the earliest times, blood mixing has undeniably taken place between the peoples, from which special new species have developed again and again, which is the result to this day. That simply had to be said.
And it has been well explained, and moreover you have anticipated all the necessary explanations in a comprehensible and simple manner, which I still wanted to put forward in this respect. But now I will go on with the other explanations I had begun. 15. A spread of the disease can already occur seconds or after the moment of infection, that is to say, not only when it becomes detectable and acute. Wearing protective masks against pathogens only makes sense if they are also used sensibly, which cannot be the case if they are worn in day-to-day use on the street and in buildings instead of in crowds and in the close or confined area of people infected with the disease. On the one hand, they are basically useless in this way without protective goggles, because even popularly available masks are only useful in combination with such goggles if they are thick and dense enough to prevent the exhalation of breath and the spread of expiratory droplets, and they cannot be picked up or inhaled from outside or by other persons. Ordinary face masks, however, are of no use in this respect because they are usually not suitable for a protective function against bacteria and viruses, and normally only against dust, sand, and pollen and the like. The only useful masks are special filter masks and special medical masks. So, on the one hand, protective masks should be equipped for a specific purpose, and on the other hand, they should only be used if there is an effective purpose associated with them. But if this does not correspond to a necessity and protective masks are still worn, then this is not only nonsensical, but also ridiculous and amounts to a carnival act. 16. The incubation period, or the time between infection and the outbreak and acute development of the corona. Epidemic corresponds to the time that elapses between infection with the pathogen and the appearance of the first symptoms. The incubation period of this disease is insidious and cannot simply be fixed at 14 days, as is erroneously claimed by ignorant medical practitioners or by virologists, etc., according to our initial research, clarifications and findings. The incubation period can be up to 1 month or even up to 3 months, depending on the case, but also from a few hours up to a few years, depending on the type and condition of the immune system. 17. Our findings and knowledge also show that the coronavirus, which at times undergoes genetic changes, behaves very aggressively to fatally in the organism of human beings, depending on the corresponding state of the immune system. But on the other hand, it is also restrained, whereby a recovery develops. Although this does not correspond to a complete destruction of the virus, consequently a new outbreak is possible at any time. Our findings show that certain genetic variants do not disappear even during recovery, but remain latent, but are not immediately recognizable or detectable, as is also the case with various other diseases. In the case of this insidious corona disease, however, it can happen unexpectedly at some point after years or decades, for example through intimate contact, that the latent, dormant evil can be transmitted. In which case, an unusual phenomenon occurs in such a way that as a result of the changed genetic variations of the known virus, a disease reaction occurs in a completely different form. However, it is not possible to grasp this fact through earthly research with the medical and virological apparatus and other technology because, according to our foresight, the instruments required for this cannot yet be developed and constructed in the present third millennium. Earth humans believe that they have at their disposal a highly developed technology with very highly developed technical values. But as far as the truth is concerned, it must be said that the entire earthly technology of every kind is no more than a first step out of deepest darkness into a faint glimmer of a still very distant light. 18. As a conclusion to my remarks, it is also to be said that our investigations after worldwide research have shown that in all countries, completely inadequate or no epidemic laws exist, as well as no decisive understanding whatsoever of how and when an epidemic or pandemic must be effectively countered in order to prevent it.
Your father Svath has already explained this to me. But what you have now explained and elaborated is probably all thrown to the wind again by various so-called experts with and without academic titles, such as doctors, biologists, chemists, immunologists, and virologists, etc., doubted as well as probably by the majority of the people who, as usual, want to know everything better. In addition, as is always the case when something special happens, all the clever ones of all kinds, starting with the highest rulers and going down to the people at the foot of the majority of humanity, come to reveal their bogus explanations and thus want to make themselves big and important with the banalities, bogus knowledge, bogus intelligence, and completely stupid nonsense they rattle off. Particularly pathetic are the highest rulers who make themselves incredibly important, but in reality neither understand anything about the whole of what they are talking about. Nor are they effectively far-sighted and consequently also cannot order logical measures and also cannot implement and enforce such measures. And that is effectively the case worldwide. Unfortunately also here in Switzerland, where I see only one person in the federal parliament whom I do not have to count among the failures and to whom I can pay my respects, which I have also done and received a handwritten appreciation for it.
All this is known to me, and as for their posturing regarding their bogus wisdom that they parade in public pompous statements to media such as newspapers, journals, lectures, radio and television, etc., is just embarrassing and ridiculous.
It is. But something else. The other day you said something about cold LED light being harmful to the eyes and even causing blindness. Can you maybe explain more about that?
Of course I can. Cold LED light damages the retina's photoreceptors. especially bright white light such as that emitted by hand lamps and beam lamps, cars and bicycles, and the lights of some computers and toys, as well as smartphones, lamps, billboards, or headlights. LED lights are the equivalent of energy savers and are widely used in everyday electronics, but they are by no means as harmless as is generally claimed. LED light has a high phototoxic potential that causes oxidative processes in the eye retina, damaging proteins and lipids, and ultimately leading to irreparable deterioration of photoreceptors. Typical of this is, for example, maculopathy, or a group of diseases of the retina of the eyes which causes many new blindnesses. Although it takes a lot of blue light from LEDs to damage the retina, LED blue light overexposure persists, especially in relation to children and juveniles, whose eyes can filter blue light only poorly and much worse than is the case with adults, especially at night. The eyes are much more sensitive than during the day, so their optical perception system is also much more sensitive, which is why more caution should be taken before any exposure to blue light. Such exposure causes a particular problem because it can provoke tissue damage in the retina. Because LED light is used especially at night, and thus at a time when the eyes are adjusted to darkness and are many times more sensitive to light, and therefore also react much more strongly to it. Especially at night, the eyes start to hurt because the retina lets through more light than during the day when strong light enters it, such as from headlights. So there is an additional risk from LED light. So if the human beings are exposed to more LED blue light, it hits the eyes hard and damages them because they are not adjusted to this particular exposure. This risk does not only apply to children and juveniles, whose cornea and lens are particularly permeable to high-frequency light rays, but also to adults, which means that all Earth humans have a problem with this, even if it is different for older people. Namely, that their eye lenses and cornea no longer transmit as much light. But in their retina and immediately below it, there are the pigment-like lipofuscins, which additionally release free radicals and can trigger oxidative processes. So bright and high LED blue light is mainly harmful to both younger and older human beings. The LED blue light influence on the internal clock of the human being suppresses the hormonal clock generator for the day-night rhythm, namely the release of melatonin, an important hormone for cell regeneration. The concentration normally increases tenfold at night, but this is greatly reduced under the influence of LED blue light, and the increase is smaller, thus hormonally putting the human beings less into sleep mode. The result is that the quality of sleep deteriorates, which also disturbs the metabolism and creates a susceptibility to cardiovascular diseases and also damage to the retina. Furthermore, the LED blue light also attacks the cells there not only directly but also indirectly, which greatly reduces their regeneration.
If it is all right with you, I would like to come back to the corona epidemic, namely in relation to the protective masks, to which you said that these are only useful if protective goggles are also worn. In this respect, a more detailed explanation would certainly be important, as you have explained everything to me privately. So I think you could also say something enlightening about face masks, their nature and usefulness in use, etc., which is certainly more enlightening than the banal and inadequate blather of those earthlings who make themselves important with big and stupid sayings, but in reality understand nothing about the whole thing, but whom the majority of the people believe instead of listening to the real experts and following their instructions. It would also be good if you could briefly explain the most important differences between the various mysterious disease and epidemic pathogens. That is to say, the microorganisms, the disgusting viruses, and the other disgusting unhealing pathogens. It would also be important to give some explanations about the way of life, the function of life, the reproduction, the action, behavior, and other important aspects of the various bacteria and viruses. An informative word would also be good for the treatment or fight against the pathogens. But please, if you want to do that, then please make it understandable for us laymen.
You are probably right to discuss some of the necessary things about what has already been said at another time, for which I will then, on the one hand, repeat what I have already explained. On the other hand, however, I can also explain and elaborate a little more on this, and also with regard to your question concerning the differences between the pathogens. To explain the differences between pathogens in detail would lead much too far, which is why I do not want to go into this, but only go so far as to mention that many different germs or microorganisms are to be mentioned that cause processes that are harmful to health, such as bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, protists, algae, amoebas, prions, or viroids and virusoids. These microorganisms cause harmful effects, and in particular because they, 1. Cause high fever, which can be fatal by inducing violent immune reactions. 2. Cause tissue damage by feeding on body cells. 3. Secrete active substances that are harmful to the body. 4. Release body-damaging substances when they die. By secreting toxins, bacteria damage the organism they infect, whereby living bacteria release exotoxins, mostly proteins, which...
Excuse me, exotoxins are the toxins that cause, for example, whooping cough and cholera, right? At least that's what I learned as a boy from our family doctor, Dr. Strabel, when my 2 brothers, Carl and Gottlieb, and my sister Bertha had whooping cough. When I had to be vaccinated against cholera in Turkey, I was told that this disease was caused by exotoxins, but so was tetanus, against which I had to be vaccinated several times over the years.
That is correct. But these toxins also cause scarlet fever and diphtheria, etc. But there are also the endotoxins, which are released as parts of the cell wall of the bacteria, and these are released when the bacteria die and cause, for example, salmonellosis or typhoid fever, etc. The danger of the pathogens for human beings is great, whereby various risk groups are given, which, however, would also lead too far to explain. As far as pathogens are concerned, there is a difference between bacteria and viruses. But both have very few things in common, however, that both bacteria and viruses can cause diseases, whereas they are completely different in many areas, also with regard to reproduction and metabolism. Viruses are not actually living organisms as such, but they are infectious, cell-less organic structures that exist everywhere in all universes, with a number known to us of around 2.7 million different species and generally have the ability to replicate and evolve, with many also acting as hosts amongst themselves. Viruses are not self-sufficient living beings, but purely independent and autonomous structural forms. Yet in primeval times they were the actual factors for the beginning of all life formation, whereby an innumerable mass changed through their evolution into life-first forms, from which the first lower life forms developed over eons of time, which as a result of their evolutionary ability grew into ever higher forms. This also included the many types of bacteria, which, as effective living beings, required a different basis than the viruses from whose transformation they emerged, for as life forms they required, for example, oxygen, sulfur, and other chemical substances, or light, etc. The size of the 2 pathogens is also different and enormous, for bacteria can have a diameter of about 0.6 to 1.0 micrometers, whereas viruses, however, are about 100 times smaller. Viruses have a simple construction and consist practically only of genetic material that is stored in a protein envelope. This, while bacteria have a cell wall and the necessary cell organs, but lack a cell nucleus, and their genetic material lies in a liquid basic substance of the bacterial cell, which provides them with everything they need to reproduce independently. So bacteria can reproduce independently by cell division, and they do not need a host to do so, just in contrast to viruses, which always need a host to reproduce. Therefore, when they enter the body of a human being or a mammal, etc., and enter a cell. They pass on their genetic material to this cell and manipulate the host cell and multiply enormously quickly, so that they always produce new viruses with the genetic material they have introduced, which leave their host cell, destroy it, and infect and manipulate other cells again. If, in contrast to viruses, which have no metabolism, bacteria are examined, then they are completely different because, like all living beings, they are life forms and correspond to organized units which are also capable of evolution, have a metabolism as well as irritability, are also capable of reproduction, and are also classified as growth, which is not peculiar to viruses. Also, as far as bacteria and viruses as pathogens are concerned, they act in different ways to cause and spread disease. Bacteria sneak into an organism and then multiply when conditions are right for them. They also secrete their toxic metabolic products, which damage the immune system but do not destroy cells, but nevertheless affect the organism, causing illness and disease. In contrast, viruses attack cells in order to multiply, destroying them, but the body's own immune system also does this when the cells are attacked by viruses. Different pathogens, such as bacteria and viruses, naturally require different substances or drugs to combat them, and these must also be specifically targeted at the different species, their structure, reproduction, and effect. In the case of bacteria, as a rule, special control substances must be used, such as antibiotics, which attack the cell structures or the cell wall, which has a different structure to the human cell and therefore suffers no damage from the medication of the pathogen and kill the bacterium. As far as viruses are concerned, although there are a few and really only single medicines against them, as a rule in the case of a virus-related disease, the virus cannot be fought and therefore also not killed. But basically only the symptoms treated and alleviated, which occur, so to speak, as an annoying and possibly dangerous side effect and cause mischief. Only these symptoms can be combated and resolved, while the viral disease, however, rages on and cannot be resolved. This is also the reason why certain viral diseases are often fatal, especially in epidemics and pandemics, when the body's own immune system is not energetic enough to cope with and defeat the virus. However, vaccinations can be useful in contrast to bacteria as long as a suitable vaccine is available. If this is the case, then preventive protection against many viral infections can be gained. Vaccinations against multiplication can inhibit infection, but this is really only the case for very few viruses. But as far as the large masses are concerned, which number in the millions, for example, cold viruses, only vaccinations are usually effective because normally the immune system and the entire human organism can cope with the disease on its own. If this is not possible, then there are practically only two possibilities: death or a lifetime of infirmity. But as far as the protective masks are concerned, the following is to be said: there are different kinds of them, but Earth humans call them different names and also use them wrongly. Protective masks against infection by any pathogens are erroneously called mouth masks, but they are not such, which are intended to ward off and spread germs or pathogens. Mouth masks, which are worn only in front of the mouth, correspond to simple, thin, single-layer fabric masks that serve solely to protect and prevent any substances from entering or leaving the mouth from the outside, such as mucus, spit, and food particles, etc. So this type of mask is not suitable as protection against infections of any pathogens. Occupational safety masks are completely unsuitable against infection by any pathogens and serve only the purpose of protection against certain substances arising as a result of the activity, whereby these masks are equipped precisely only against the penetration of these certain substances into the mouth and the respiratory organ. Fabric masks of own production, which are often made privately for some reason, for example to prevent dust, etc., from entering the respiratory system or the mouth, are completely unsuitable against infections by any pathogens, as are scarves and headscarves, etc. In this respect, such things usually only serve to calm the thoughts and feelings, whereby the wearing of such masks conveys a false sense of security. Protective masks against gases, as well as effective gas masks, can, depending on their nature, prevent infections by any pathogens, which, however, cannot be the case in every way. Matter particle protective masks, which are effective against penetration into the mouth and respiratory system, such as against dust, sand, ashes, and other fine material substances, are also absolutely unsuitable against infections by any pathogens, because with regard to bacteria, viruses, microbes, and other pathogens, they are completely useless. Protective masks against infection by any pathogens correspond to mask products which are specially manufactured for this purpose and accordingly fulfill the purpose of preventing infection in their design, density, and appropriate filtering. Medical masks correspond to the only effectively effective products against infections by pathogens, both against viruses and bacteria as well as against other pathogens, of which a larger number is given. Genuine medical masks are equipped with special filters and, depending on the type and product, may contain disinfectants, which provide comprehensive safety and prevent infections. The wearing of valuable protective masks only makes sense if they are also used sensibly, which cannot be the case if they are worn in day-to-day use without necessity when there is little pedestrian traffic on the street and in buildings used by few people, rather than where it is necessary, such as for medical care of all kinds, for essential activities in the company of coworkers, for conversations in small circles, in small groups of persons and large gatherings of people, or in the close or confined area of persons suffering from disease or epidemics, whether indoors or outdoors. Protective goggles of various types and uses, which can be sealed all around the skin, are essential where there is a risk of injury to the eyes, or in particular cases of infection by bacteria or viruses, because the moisture of the eyes is a particular focus of susceptibility to viral pathogens. In principle, good and correct face masks are also completely useless if they are put on without suitable protective goggles, as is also the case with simple or self-made masks available on the market, because they are only of any use when worn with suitable protective goggles. However, this is only the case if they are thick and tight enough and are used for the purpose for which they are intended and can guarantee that they are able to prevent one's own strong expulsion of breath and the spread of expiratory droplets to the outside, but also prevent the expulsion of breath and droplets from being absorbed and inhaled from outside or by other persons. Protective masks are only useful if they fit correctly around the face and completely cover both the mouth and the respiratory system. If there is a risk of infection by pathogens, strict attention must be paid to maintaining a sufficient safety distance of 1.5 to 2 meters between interlocutors in normal communications, but this only applies in rooms and locations protected from the wind. While in the event of wind, depending on its strength, correspondingly greater distances must be observed, because pathogens are transmitted through the air over greater distances as a result of wind. If communications are conducted with persons who cough or also expectorate, sneeze or excrete salivating moisture when speaking, then a safety distance of 3 meters or more, as appropriate, must be maintained. However, what remains to be said and explained with regard to the coronavirus is that we have now thoroughly researched it in many respects and have gained valuable knowledge in the process. Thus, this corresponds to a germ which, according to our research and findings, has special properties in its novel creation. This insidious virus created in secret laboratories is a germ which, because it is not a living being but a virus, cannot be killed but only paralyzed and put out of action. And this virus is particularly dangerous because it is equipped with a mutating gene alteration ability, from which new variations of disease symptoms emerge and can infect various other life forms than just adult human beings, so also juveniles and children, as well as other living beings. It is difficult to fathom what a disease is then, because such infections reveal symptoms that are similar to other and already known diseases and can therefore be wrongly defined and consequently medically also wrongly treated. Children, for example, especially the younger ones, are affected by one of the various mutations of the coronavirus, which has a particularly inflammatory effect on the heart and lungs. According to our findings, a great danger of infection by the coronavirus, transmitted from one human being to another, as well as by other circumstances, is that the majority of today's Earth humans have fallen prey to a general irresponsible indifference and carelessness, as a result of a confused belief in God, from which they vegetate and believe in a delusion of faith, that the whole of the corona plague is either a punishment of God or a test of God, or if not, that God will already judge it and have mercy, that on the one hand one's own personality will be spared from the evil, and on the other hand that only the guilty will be punished and swept away by the plague, after which God will end the whole evil event again. Now, however, there are other facts to be mentioned, for it is not only human beings who are infected by the corona plague, but, as I have already mentioned, also other living beings who come into contact with infected human beings or through their excretions, such as feces, urine and sewage with which the infecting and still active virus is excreted and thus become infected. If these creatures come into contact with the coronavirus-infected excretions in the open, wild creatures can become contaminated, fall ill, and spread the disease. But there are also domestic animals and other mammals, beetles, birds, etc., which, as in human beings, can be infected, sometimes with lung diseases and other diseases of various organs. Through mutation, various coronavirus gene changes that have arisen and continue to arise can form new gene variations that lead to various disease patterns, which can also be incorrectly assessed and incorrectly treated by medical practitioners. A danger of infection arises not only from the transmission of the virus from one human being to another human being, but also because the virus can be deposited in some places and survive for a longer period of time before it becomes weak and loses its effectiveness, thus causing infections in human beings that can lead to death. In the above-mentioned and in other ways, the virus corresponds to a special danger, because it attacks not only the lungs, but also other organs and causes life-threatening diseases. And this is particularly true of the organs liver, heart, coronary vessels, kidneys, brain, and pancreas, and also of the blood vessels and heart valves, which are in the foreground in this respect. This, while the respiratory organ, the mouth and the eyes correspond to the basic organs of contamination, that is to say, the organs that take up the infecting virus, after which it is transported to the various organs. With regard to a dangerous and possibly fatal disease caused by the coronavirus, it is often true that, excluding a lung disease, absolutely different organ dysfunctions occur, which are caused because the virus then infects other organs. As a rule, such an infestation inevitably leads to impulses caused by thoughts and feelings, which immediately lead to a negative influence on the psyche, which weakens the moral state and thus the physical state, and the virus attack is given the opportunity to spread and take effect, whereby it can become uninhibitedly effective. In this whole process, according to our findings, it further emerges that the earthly medical sciences do not take into consideration the fact that the infection also results in a negatively forming mental state of the human being due to thoughts and feelings, through which the entire organism and thus inevitably also the entire immune system is impaired. Consequently, the latter becomes attuned to it and does not defend itself extensively against the attack of the dangerous germ. Consequently, the attacking and health-disrupting virus can spread more and more and cause structural changes in the cells and tissues. Exactly this extremely important factor has, however, according to our observations and findings, neither been recognized nor taken into account in the earthly medical sciences so far. Consequently, patients are also not additionally treated in this respect with suitable specialist means and advice. The main attack or infection of the virus, however, is directed at the central respiratory organ, at the two lungs, which correspond to a paired organ serving for respiration, which takes in oxygen from the respiratory air and processes it, whereby carbon dioxide is produced as the end product, which is then transported away and excreted. The lung already begins at the triangular lung region, namely at the side of the lung facing the mediastinal cavity, a vertically running tissue space in the thoracic cavity. Here the pulmonary stalk or pulmonary artery and pulmonary veins are attacked. So are the main bronchi with their accompanying vessels as well as the lymphatic vessels, and so the virus penetrates into the lung. Simply explained, it basically affects the side of the trachea that is attacked and infected by the virus. Consequently, the infection enters the branching of the hollow organ and thus the two main bronchi. And so it can also enter the cavity to the blood vessels via the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins. Regarding the immune system, which must also be addressed and about which some explanation is needed, it must be stated that this basically corresponds to the body's own defense system, which has to protect the whole body from diseases. To put it more precisely, its function is to protect the entire protein body, all organs and cells, and thus the body's own structure. By means of a defense against foreign substances and pathogens such as bacteria, viruses, microorganic parasites, or fungi, and thus to maintain the health of the entire organism. The prerequisite for this is that the immune system's ability to distinguish between the body's own and foreign structures functions properly, as a result of which a defensive immune reaction only takes place against an invading virus, bacterium, or microorganism, but not against the body's own composition. The task of the immune system thus corresponds to a defense system that fights foreign bacteria, viruses, and microorganisms that impair the organism's health, whereby it recognizes, attacks, and, if possible, destroys foreign malignant pathogens that penetrate the organism from the outside, as well as pathological endogenous cells. The immune system of the human being has thus developed over millions of years as a defense system against foreign bacteria, viruses, fungi, and microorganisms that penetrate the body and pose a threat to health, and it also detects and fights pathological cells that develop in the organism itself. On the one hand, this is because this defense system is divided into two main systems, namely a fundamentally innate, non-specific immune system, which is primarily fundamentally responsible for the main fight against bacterial infections. In addition, there is a second immune system which is acquired over time and which fights specifically against certain pathogens. With the help of this specific immune system, the body is able to fight encapsulated bacteria and viruses which produce rapidly changing surface structures by evolution or mutation. These specific and non-specific defense mechanisms inherent in the immune system are closely interlinked, although it is important to note that this defensive compensation can only function if it is provided with the necessary means by which it can strengthen itself. This is usually done through the intake of food, which usually contains all those substances that strengthen the immune system, such as vitamins, trace elements and proteins, etc., whereby, for example, vitamin A in particular is important for vision, skin, hair, mucous membranes, teeth, and gums, and vitamin C in particular for the body's own defenses and wound healing. In addition to these, there is also vitamin D, which is important for healthy bone and tooth formation and also prevents infections. Vitamin E is also important, and along with vitamin A and vitamin C, is one of the most important antioxidants. In this function, it protects the cells from oxidative stress, through which the free radicals gain the upper hand and can cause considerable damage. Vitamin K, on the other hand, is of utmost importance for blood clotting, as well as in relation to bone health. It is found mainly in plant foods such as kale and spinach, while biotin or vitamin H activates enzyme reactions that play a central role in metabolism, as they are also important for glucose formation and the breakdown of fatty acids, as well as for the breakdown of some amino acids. Vitamin B5, pantothenic acid, is also important and plays an extremely important role in almost the entire metabolism and for strong nails. This is briefly mentioned in this respect, but a more detailed list would have to include various other factors and substances. What is to be explained further with regard to the corona epidemic and its effects on the organism is that the virus causes vascular diseases in the lungs, whereby emerging inflammations cut off the supply of oxygen to the blood and thus inevitably lead to a life-threatening lack of oxygen, which often leads to death. This dangerous phenomenon then requires a blood-thinning measure which under certain circumstances can reduce or even stop the whole danger. You can take an example from yourself when your heart valve became so narrowed due to deposits that you recognized this situation on your own sensible consideration and resorted to a blood thinner, which alleviated the problem but did not completely eliminate it. This problem could only be halfway resolved when Eva admitted you to the university hospital and a new heart valve was implanted. Although you were then prescribed a plasma expander or a blood thinner medication as a permanent medication, the heart valve did not continue to function well until you took another medication of the same type on your own initiative and have been using it every day since then. Such a blood-thinning drug alone could, depending on the quantity, be helpful in one or the other case of oxygen deficiency caused by the corona plague. As our tests on organic pharmaceutical apparatuses created for this purpose have conditionally proven, at least in initial trials. Further experiments, tests and examinations on organic pharmaceutical apparatuses, which have been reconstructed for human use, have produced absolutely clear results. That in the case of the coronavirus epidemic there are undoubtedly, and effectively without any doubt, 5 indisputable factors, namely the following. 1. Even if in one or the other case a recovery from the corona epidemic occurs, this does not necessarily lead to immunity, but only to a sham recovery, which, however, cannot be recognized medically as such, but only by certain special apparatus. Such apparatuses do not exist on Earth, but will only become reality in the distant future. 2. In this state, the epidemic effectively continues to exist as a pure impulse in an acutely remaining state of rest. Consequently, it can again actively proceed through certain circumstances. This, however, does not correspond to a reactivation of the epidemic, but to a continuation of its course, or rather an effective awake active further being active, which at first is not visible and not recognizable, but then unexpectedly becomes detectable again when a new outbreak occurs from the acutely remaining state of rest. This is because there is no recovery, but only a pseudo-recovery, and the disease continues to exist only as an impulse without a direct causative agent. 3. Another form has emerged in our experiments. Examinations and tests with organic pharmaceutical apparatuses simulating human beings in such a way that, in certain cases, after a medically proven recovery from the corona epidemic, no complete immunity has emerged, but only a latent power of resistance has been recorded, as a result of which a new infection was circumferentially unavoidable. 4. A further phenomenon of our experiments, tests and examinations with human replica organic pharmaceutical apparatuses resulted in the fact that replica human bodies, provided with all vital organs, which were infected with the coronavirus. did not produce any detectable pathological manifestations, but nevertheless produced antibodies which clearly showed that an infection had taken place and was present, although it was not detectable. 5. After a medically proven recovery from the corona plague, immunity to the coronavirus can occur, but this can only be temporary and need not be permanent, as is the case after other viral diseases and illnesses. Thus, it is possible that a human being who has recovered from the corona epidemic and who is medically immune can, under certain circumstances, become infected with the corona epidemic again after a certain time and fall ill again. At the outset, I must now explain, because you call up, write down and publish my statements, that my information is in no way a substitute for professional advice or treatment by trained Earth specialists, as these are also given on Earth and must be consulted because they are versed in Earth medicine and the diseases of Earth humans, whereas I myself have only rudimentary knowledge in this respect. So I, for my part, have to explain that if I should mention medicines, etc., as well as advice, these are not to be used carelessly. Just as no independent diagnoses are to be made, just as no medicines are to be used without a doctor's order, and also no improper treatments are to be started or carried out. The fact is that when drugs, which are in petri dishes, etc., kill germs, then this is not the case in the organism in the same way, because effectively the drugs, and thus also vaccines, explicitly strengthen the immune system and shape it to the corresponding pathogens, whereby the immune system then carries out the work of killing the pathogens such as bacteria, fungi, and microorganisms. Viruses, on the other hand, cannot be killed because they do not correspond in their nature to any living being, but only to organic structures, which can only be paralyzed and atrophy in their activity. This process also takes place with regard to any vaccine directed against viruses, whereby this is transferred in its effectiveness to the immune system and inoculates it in such a way that it acts defensively against the virus, paralyses it, and switches off its activity until it comes to a standstill and becomes completely ineffective. What is still to be said now relates to precautionary measures through the wearing of adequate protective masks, about which I will have to explain something not only today, but probably again and again. A protective mask is indispensable wherever there are various risks with regard to the inhalation of harmful mechanical or other material particles or gases of any kind, but also especially with regard to bacteria, microorganisms, viruses or chemical effects, etc. In hospitals and nursing homes, etc., it is necessary for medical personnel to wear suitable disposable protective masks to protect patients from possible germs. With the spread of the coronavirus to Europe, this is now of particular importance. Protective masks have an important meaning and function outside as well as in medical facilities, also in nursing homes, etc., but only when there is a need for them. If a person is infected by a bacterium or a virus, then there is a risk of infection to other persons, which is why a normal respirator or medical protective mask is not sufficient to protect fellow human beings from infection. Consequently, medical protective masks with appropriate filter systems are required, which must also fit the face correctly and tightly so that germs cannot penetrate the mask, nor can aerosols escape to the outside in the event of a possible unavoidable sneezing or coughing. When coughing or sneezing, it is essential to turn away from other persons and also to hold the hand or arm in front of the mouth and nose, as well as to keep an appropriate distance from other persons. Physical contact with outside persons should be avoided as far as possible. Persons experiencing respiratory problems, fever, cough, or other symptoms of illness should seek medical attention at an early stage. Strict hand hygiene is always necessary with regard to hand washing, without exception, because contagious infectious diseases are very often transmitted to other persons through this. So regular and thorough hand washing with soap and water is of permanent urgency to render pathogens harmless. Although hand disinfection is a very important measure to prevent the spread of pathogens by touching hands, hand disinfection should only be carried out by thoroughly washing hands with normal soaps, but never with chemical disinfectants. Disinfectants of all kinds do not correspond to medicines of any kind, and must therefore not be ingested, rubbed in, or injected in any way, for such agents only serve to disinfect various other kinds. In any case, the new coronavirus should, if at all possible, only be inactivated with professionally tested and approved disinfectants. 1. First and foremost, persons suffering from a bacterium or virus must wear a protective mask suitable for the disease in order to reduce the transmission of germs to other persons and their environment. Although other protective measures, hygiene requirements, and rules of conduct must also be observed by the person suffering from the disease. A. The wearing of suitable protective masks must be observed especially by ill persons. Especially if they cannot keep a minimum distance of 2 meters from other persons. B. As well as sick persons who must necessarily go outside the home to see a doctor or to a hospital. C. Just as it is also necessary for healthy persons to wear a protective mask and to keep a distance when it is unavoidable to deal with persons who are ill due to bacteria or viruses, irrespective of whether the ill person also wears a protective mask or not. B. Our findings with regard to protective masks that cover the mouth and the respiratory organ when worn, that is to say, commonly used and freely available protective masks that are worn against pathogens and are supposed to be effective, generally only correspond to token exercises, as you tend to say with regard to such or other ways of acting. Effectively, the masks have no disinfecting effect against viruses, but only the purpose of preventing the spread of respiratory output and expiratory droplets when speaking. However, such masks cannot prevent the entry and penetration of bacteria, spores, microorganisms, and viruses. These are usually made of simple or multi-layered materials such as paper and simple fabrics, and are therefore useless for defense against pathogens. Such products only prevent the penetration of material particles and the expulsion of expiratory droplets and breath. C. Wearing respirators should not be considered a general necessity, but only where it is required, such as when interacting with other persons in any way, as well as on public transport, etc. Protective masks are not recommended as a general preventive measure for healthy people, but only for patients and human beings who may have become infected or who are in close or direct contact with other persons, so that they do not spread the virus. In suspected cases, medical staff in particular should therefore wear a mask to protect themselves from droplet infection, for example. D. Cloth masks, which can be washed and reused after wearing, are only a means of prevention in terms of not allowing one's own breath and expiratory droplets to escape into the environment. In fact, however, such masks can be harmful because if they are not thoroughly cared for, they become a breeding ground for pathogens. If worn and used correctly. However, wearing such a protective mask can still be useful and effective, in the sense that it helps to maintain good hygiene habits, avoid frequent touching of the mouth and nose, and prevent the risk of smear infection. 2. In contrast to the first-mentioned protective masks, so-called simple medical masks are made of good quality materials, whereby a special soft inner fleece provides good comfort but still no protection against bacteria, viruses, and microorganisms, but prevents the release of expiratory droplets and breath. 3. To protect against infection by respiratory vapor and expiratory droplets from sick people and thus against bacteria, viruses and microorganisms, only special fine particle filter masks are suitable, which correspond to particle filtering half or full masks. Note Billy, FFP3 filter masks. These consist partly or wholly of non-replaceable filter material that highly inhibits and reduces or completely rejects infectious expiratory droplets or aerosols that are inhaled through the air into the filters. However, these respirators are not suitable for everyday use, but can only be used for 3 to 4 or at most 5 hours, after which they must be disposed of properly and replaced with new ones. 4. Effectively good and valuable special medical fine particle filter protective masks are highly suitable against bacteria, viruses, and microorganisms. These particle filtering half or full masks correspond to the best possible protective masks. Note Billy. FFP3 filter masks, the filters of which are replaceable, but can also only be used for 3 to a maximum of 5 hours and then replaced with new filters, whereby the mask itself can be cleaned and reused. 5. After a medically proven recovery from the corona epidemic, immunity to the coronavirus can occur, but this can only be temporary and does not have to be permanent, as is the case after other viral diseases and illnesses. Thus, it is possible that a human being who has recovered from the corona epidemic and who is medically proven to be immune may develop lung damage, and after a certain period of time, a new health problem may result. Viruses, bacteria, or other pathogens only have access to a body and its organs if the immune system's defenses are insufficient or non-existent, so that it is unable to fight off invading germs. This means that the pathogen can spread the disease germs uninhibited as a result of an immune deficiency and thus cause a disease. And if this then breaks out, the ability of the immune system to eliminate the germs is extinguished. There are so many factors involved that a comprehensive understanding and knowledge of how the body, organs, and immune system work is needed to be able to take control of an emerging disease oneself, as this usually requires the expertise and help of a doctor or alternative practitioner. And these, Edouard, are the main facts I had to explain. These are the main facts I had to explain with regard to your questions. However, there are various other and important factors to be mentioned, but it is not possible for me to mention them all because they would go much too far.
Thank you for your explanations. Thank you. Everything is very instructive and corresponds to what I also learned from your father Svath. When in the 1940s we were— I do not have to talk about that, because you already know everything from his annals anyway. However, I am also interested in the extent to which the data published by the authorities regarding infections and deaths in relation to the corona epidemic are correct worldwide. As a rule, these figures are not correct because, on the one hand, there are hair-raising lies and consequently false figures are given, and on the other hand, there is always a large number of unreported cases that are never discovered and never made public. Svath already said that when we observe this, that, and the other of major or worldwide epidemics during time travel. And while I'm at it, you could also say something about the great pandemic of the Spanish flu, which rolled over earthly humanity and really claimed millions of lives in the last century. Admittedly, there were also epidemics that took place far back into antiquity, and also cost many millions of human lives, but sometimes only a few, even before and after the time of Emmanuel. But if you think that there are other and more important facts to be mentioned, which is not possible for you, for whatever reason, then I would like to ask you a few more things that I consider important. If I may?
I cannot mention the important things because I am not allowed to pass on information that would find its way into the earthly sciences if it became known, because you call up our conversations and publish them. Of course, I will privately let you in on these important facts, but you will be sworn to silence about them.
You said that even with a recovery, complete destruction of the virus was not a given, and consequently a new outbreak was possible at any time. Does that mean that the corona plague is different in nature from other and previous plagues that have claimed millions of human lives?
This is indeed the case, which will be proven in 2 months. Because this coronavirus, which is only now beginning to spread extensively and worldwide, has, due to its mutability, different characteristics from those previously known to earthly virology. The beginning of the fact that in those who have recovered from the epidemic will become active again, Just as in those who have recovered, new infections will occur and thus new illnesses will occur, will be due to special circumstances, and again it will be in China where it will occur for the first time. But this too, as well as the fact that tiny droplets of expiration are spread by speaking and breathing out alone, and thus many infections take place all around, as well as those who have allegedly recovered can be newly infected again, which will actually also happen in 2 months already. This can ultimately also no longer be concealed, and consequently then inevitably made known. And various reasons will contribute to the fact of these further illnesses occurring already in 2 months. Namely, it results with this corona epidemic that a recovery cannot be equated with a recovery and also not with an immunization. And this is because in certain cases, the germs continue to exist undetectably as impulses and unexpectedly trigger activity again, and everything can become acute again, which, however, does not correspond to a reactivation, but to an unhealed or uncured, but not recognizable impulsive continued activity of the epidemic, and thus to a process which is completely unknown to earthly physicians and virologists, etc. This on the one hand, but on the other hand, as a result of the irresponsible nonsense of those returning from abroad. There will also be new infections among those who are supposedly cured in this way, among whom there will also be carriers of the virus. Without this being ascertainable for the time being, because this maliciously created and insidious virus is different from what is known to earthly virology, will not be found out. Accordingly, the WHO will also continue to fail in this respect. Consequently, also this time, no early warning will be issued by it, and loudmouth speeches will only be made again when everything happens and the virus infections reappear through the fault of those responsible for the health of the peoples.
If I understand you correctly, what you mean regarding the WHO is that it will continue to be run by zeros who are neither far-sighted enough to grasp what is about to occur. Nor will the WHO zeros issue warning information, nor will they recommend any further safety precautions. Is that what you are saying? And what I notice, you have been using the term loudmouthed lately. Is there a particular reason for that?
What you say is correct. And that I mention loudmouthedness. The reason is that all those whom I address with it actually only talk a lot of senseless nonsense and open their mouths wide and make themselves important, although all their talk is stupid and banal as well as worthless. Countless state officials, civil servants, doctors, scientists in the fields of immunology, disease control and medicine, as well as journalists and other organizations act big-headed and loud-mouthed as experts, even though their stupid and impudent ignorance is written all over their faces, as you often say. And with regard to my use of the catchword loud-mouthedness, I learned that from you, and I think that it expresses exactly what corresponds to the effective facts of these experts who talk nonsense, that is, strictly speaking, ridiculous and amounts to banal children's talk.
Aha, good, then that is also cleared up. What interests me is this. How do you judge the laws and regulations given today in the so-called civilized countries with regard to the behavior of the population in the case of epidemics, and pandemics? At least our so-called civilized countries, including all the European countries, which are trying to adapt to modernity and in doing so are making more mistakes than righteous ones by introducing new laws and regulations, etc., think they are progressive, free, and social, but in my opinion this is only a delusion. When I think about what has come about in this respect with regard to the so-called private sphere and with regard to fundamental rights, according to which, in the now imminent epidemic of the corona pandemic, these will be brought to bear and taken into consideration in a completely wrong way, as you recently said, then I dread. This privacy and the fundamental rights alone, created by the populations and their elected ineffectual head, oxen in the governments, etc., already prevent that the strict and necessary measures to prevent the spread of the epidemic cannot be rigorously enforced, and therefore it cannot be contained and stopped within a short time. And this, I assume, will also be the case in the coming months, which will cost the lives of many Earthlings. On the one hand, due to the incompetence and irresponsibility of the majority of those in power, the WHO and other know-it-alls, self-opinionated people, but also because large parts of the population will insist on their private sphere and their basic rights, and will prevent what is absolutely necessary from being done, and the epidemic from being stopped quickly. That is why it will spread viciously all over the world in the near future and cause well over 100,000 deaths, as you have clearly stated. However, clear and unambiguous epidemic laws are also lacking, which would have to stipulate that in the case of epidemics and pandemics, the so-called private sphere and fundamental rights would have to be suspended, and all measures to contain the epidemic could be carried out unrestrained by law. However, this would also require that those in power and all those otherwise responsible for the health and safety of the people would have to consist in every respect of persons who are actually capable of doing so. Precisely contrary to what is unfortunately the case today, because the majority of these people today consist of absolute incompetence who cannot do justice to their tasks and duties.
This will actually and inevitably happen in the next few months as a result of the misconduct and nonsensical pomposity of the majority of all state leaders and others responsible for the welfare of Earth humans, as well as the incompetence and know-it-alls posing as experts, as well as by the populations themselves, as a result of which the accumulating death toll will already have far exceeded 100,000 by the middle of April.
Yes. You already said that on the 2nd of January during our private conversation, and so it will be, because what you said was not calculations or guesses, but everything corresponded to a foresight of your Android foresight apparatus, which has a fully functioning brain, is capable of self-thinking and self-decision-making and...
That is correct, but in the meantime it has come to light that this apparatus, as you respectively say, is going crazy. Like the two androids that eliminated themselves back in October 1980. If I may take the liberty of making a comparison to this, I will say that our prediction apparatus is going as mad as the present totally ineffectual lunatic and unpredictable President Trump of the United States of America.
Oha, now that is well said. Kudos, I never would have expected that from you.
I'm still capable of learning, even at my age.
Quite obvious and audible. But one more question. How it is that, contrary to the truth, hand disinfection is propagated to be done with chemical disinfectants, and is therefore harmful to the skin and health. Yet medical experts and virologists etc. recommend the nonsense of hand disinfection anyway. But what would be important to talk about is also what Svath said about disinfecting when disinfection becomes necessary. I wrote an article about this years ago. I was in India at that time, probably in 1963, and gave it to an elderly lady, a Swiss woman from Switzerland, who was very interested in what I explained to her, precisely what I had learned from Svath regarding disinfection. This old lady, she was over 70 years old, was in contact with people in Germany who were also interested in it, which is why she had sent it to them. Later she told me that my article had made a big impression on various groups in Germany, and had also led to efforts being made to get to the bottom of the whole thing as a result of the information given. I was told by Svath that chemical disinfectants, which already existed at that time, are harmful to the skin, and should therefore not be used for hand or body disinfection because they kill the necessary skin bacteria, attack the skin, dry it out, and as I said, damage it. Ask it, Simyase Quetzal, and you have also said several times that disinfectants are extremely harmful in every respect if they are used unnecessarily, especially for hand disinfection. Today, as a result of the coronavirus epidemic, this is being propagated in a really stupid and irrational way, even by doctors, virologists, chemists, and immunologists, etc., whereby the Earthlings wrongly understand that chemical disinfectants should be used for this purpose, which is, however, fundamentally wrong. This is precisely because they may bring more harm than good. In addition, you have explained that such chemical agents would also weaken the immune system and make it all the more susceptible to germs. Basically, as Svath and all of you have always said, Only natural means of disinfection should be used, unless special circumstances and situations require highly concentrated chemical disinfectants, such as when treating wounds or performing operations. In daily use, however, no chemical disinfectants should be used by the general public, but should be left to medical professionals such as doctors, surgeons, medical assistants, and medical nurses. All other human beings should use only completely natural hand disinfectants, such as natural oils, appropriate soaps, or simply water. Chemical disinfectants should only be used by the people for disinfecting goods, toilets, rooms, clothes, the environment, and wounds, but never for hand and body disinfection. Repeating a few things, I would like to say the following. In general, hand cleanliness, hand and body hygiene, a household, a room or a flat cannot be equated with a necessary chemical disinfection, because hygiene does not need chemical disinfection, as is necessary for medical personnel, etc., as well as in an operating theater or in surgeries. Consequently, chemical disinfectants and cleaning agents with toxic active ingredients should be avoided. Chemical disinfectants used in the household lead to resistant germs that then infect human beings and can no longer be killed with disinfectants, against which medicines are also no longer effective. Microorganisms, such as bacteria, viruses, and fungi, are everywhere and are both bad and good. Consequently, not all of them are harmful in every case. The fact is that human beings even depend on them and their lives depend on them. They form a protective layer on the skin, help digestion in the intestines, and many foods would not exist without bacteria, such as wine, beer, and yogurt, as well as no cheese, salami, and other foods, and even certain important medicines. Around 100 trillion bacteria live in the human body, which is many times more than the body has cells. Therefore, it is also inevitable for human beings that their environment and their body, and thus also their hands, are never free of bacteria, which also applies to the immune system, which needs bacteria in order to be able to deal with them and build itself up in a strengthening way. I remember this from Sfath, but I do not know what the connections are between bacteria and the immune system, so please explain it to me as well. But what I do know very well is that chemical disinfectants do more harm than good. Now, on top of everything, I want to ask you if you want to explain some important things about this.
I can comply with your wish, but I have to say that my explanations are somewhat lengthy and that I have to repeat certain important facts many times, because only through constant repetition do these facts stick in the minds of human beings and may also be used when they are needed. And since I assume that you will make available to the public all that we are discussing together today as a result of the corona plague, repetitions of significant fakes will be all the more important. Now, first of all, it is to be said that the so-called official data concerning the infections and deaths from the corona plague must be calculated between 10 and 11 times higher than is truthfully stated as official information in most countries of Earth. And this will be especially so in the next few months, as we already discussed together last year on November 30th and this year on January 2nd and 6th. Partly, a cover-up tactic is already being carried out at the moment by deliberately giving false information. But this will be done even more in the coming months, thereby lulling the peoples into a false sense of security. It will also be denied that this corona plague is the work of man, secretly carried on by criminal research for the purpose of a new biological weapon, according to which 2 persons were infected by a laboratory accident, who then, before they died, carried the plague out, whereby it was released into the world and is now spreading. The purpose of all this is already known to you since the 1940s, about which you shall continue to keep silent, but may explain to inquiries that the whole thing corresponds to machinations carried out in a secret laboratory by a private group to create a biological weapon, on which 23 persons are still working today, who, however, have given up their activities in Wuhan and continue to work on their delusional project elsewhere. It is also to be said that the government of China is neither aware of the secret private machinations of the delusionists, nor is it itself involved in the whole thing in any way. What is now being done in all countries by those responsible for the state and the populations in a mindless and senselessly stupid way will have the consequence that in the course of the next few months the number of coronavirus infections will rise into the first millions, while the number of deaths will also be very high. And this will be so because the majority of the responsible state leaders in all countries are completely incapable of foresight and equally incapable of exercising the office as well as incapable of assuming responsibility. Therefore, they are also incapable of determining and implementing the necessary measures to slow down the corona pandemic, which already started in December last year, and to let it run to death, which will be the doom of many tens of thousands of Earth humans and lead them to their death. Also, what should have been done in China, in Wuhan, in December, but was irresponsibly not done, has shown that the Chinese government is also incapable of its office, as it is proving especially in the USA through the loud-mouthed, incompetent and mad President Trump, and he will cause a corona catastrophe as a result of his self-importance, confusion, and double bean straw stupidity. In the same way, however, the likewise foolishly insolent President Bolsonaro in Brazil, who is self-important and power-obsessed, will also act, just as in Europe and all over the world the irresponsibility, stupidity, and incompetence of the heads of state will cause many deaths. Unfortunately, however, many unteachable and equally stupid Earth humans from all walks of life in all countries will also contribute greatly to the spread of the corona epidemic and to the ever-increasing number of deaths. This is because they will not adhere to the safety measures already very poorly ordered by the authorities and governments. Around the world, the coronavirus pandemic will be the main topic of discussion in the coming months in all media, such as television broadcasts, radios, magazines, newspapers, and discussion panels, etc. In the process, all kinds of ignorant doctors, virologists, and immunologists, the majority of those responsible for the state and countless journalists, as well as epidemic and security officials, etc., will presume to be experts in order to offer nonsensical theories, advice, conjecture, and etc., even the WHO and its organizers, who have so far completely failed to recognize the epidemic and to warn all countries of the impending pandemic, will only speak up when the pandemic is so rampant that it has already claimed many lives. So the fact is that this organization is also staffed by ignorant and incompetent people, as is the case with the majority of state officials. All of them live irresponsibly at the expense of the taxpayers with unjustifiably high salaries, incapable of any necessary foresight and ability to grasp and assess the effective situation in a crisis situation, to make correct decisions and to have the inevitably correct orders enforced and executed. Through lies and deceit, the majority of all irresponsible state leaders, who are already today the true irresponsible ones and will also be so in the times to come, will protect themselves, but will not enforce what would be necessary that the peoples would also be sufficiently protected. Consequently, a great many deaths will have to be mourned. And if the whole of the epidemic pandemic, which is now just beginning to spread correctly, were not to be alleviated by a certain circumstance and finally end, then it would result that in relation to earlier great epidemics and pandemics, and according to the then and now population figures of Earth humans, today worldwide over 9 billion, the coronavirus pandemic would ultimately claim a mass of 500 million or 500 million epidemic deaths. Just comparing the mass of today's overpopulation of more than 9 billion. In contrast to the world population of 1.9 billion at the time of the Spanish flu, which according to our very accurate records from 1918 to 1920 claimed 53 million, 416,012 dead in 3 waves, a death toll of 500 million would be possible if a certain circumstance did not put an end to the whole thing. And this threatening factor of 500 million deaths would have to be blamed worldwide first and foremost on the majority of those responsible for the state in terms of their irresponsibility. Incompetence, guilt, and loudmouthedness, as will also be the case in the coming months when a great many corona deaths will have to be mourned. In the second place, the peoples themselves would have to be mentioned, because they would not adhere to the necessary safety precautions without understanding and reason, as will also be the case in the coming months, which is why a high death rate will also be unavoidable through the fault of the peoples themselves. The already inadequate, but irresponsible measures ordered and carried out by those responsible for the state in the coming weeks will not correspond to what should be effective. Consequently, the pandemic will spread unchecked worldwide. However, the majority of those responsible for the state will still not grasp what the coronavirus pandemic, which began 3 months ago in December 2019, really means, just as many doctors. Virologists and immunologists will not be aware of it either, because they are working on the basis of completely false assumptions, even from the time the virus outbreak became known in December 2019. But this is also the case today, as it will also be in the coming months, which is why ill-considered as well as uninformed and stupid speeches are being made, and wrong behavior and stupid false teachings are being spread regarding hand disinfection and the wearing of protective masks, etc., which may cause more harm than good. This, however, is not known even to many professionals, which is why people are being recommended something that is dangerous to their health. As is already happening in the same way, and as pharmacies, drugstores, sales outlets, and manufacturers will also be doing in the near future with regard to chemical disinfection products. What had to be said concerning protective masks and other protective measures I have already explained, but concerning your question concerning hand disinfection, the following is still of actual importance. The non-medical use of chemical hand and body disinfectants is in any case harmful to health. So it is to be repeated. Chemical disinfectants are effectively very harmful to the health of human beings, both when used for hand and body disinfection. This is the case because skin, body or hand disinfectants contain substances that are harmful to health. One of the worst being the so-called triclosan, which damages liver cells and causes liver fibrosis. Disinfections with chemical substances are not only harmful to health, but they also have only a short-term effect because their effectiveness quickly fades. While the toxins contained in the agents penetrate through the pores into the skin and have a damaging effect on the organism, causing organic ailments as the case may be. Furthermore, chemical disinfectants radically kill off the bacteria that are essential to the health and life of the skin, which makes it even more susceptible to pathogens as well as to other dangerous bacteria and viruses. Long-term exposure to disinfectants such as triclosan causes not only liver fibrosis in human beings, but also other inflammatory changes in the liver. Apart from this, such disinfectants also cause many other organic ailments and diseases, including liver cancer and various other types of cancer, which, like many other things, is still unknown to all earthly medical science. This, as well as the fact, unknown to them, that, which I would like to mention in passing, many kinds of cosmetics are also the cause of organic ailments, diseases, and various kinds of cancer, beginning with so-called harmless skin products of many kinds, which, however, contain chemical substances, as well as lipsticks, hair dyes, and many other cosmetics. Chemical disinfectants are and remain an absolute risk factor for the health and the entire organism of human beings when they are used to disinfect the hands or the body. Such chemical agents, if no chemical-free ones are available, should only be used under necessary protective measures for the health of human beings, such as exclusively for the disinfection of tangible things like door handles. lavatories, bathrooms, floors, windows, rooms, walls, and if necessary, under certain circumstances, also articles of clothing, etc., but never for the skin and the body. Also, various toothpastes or shampoos, etc., are not compatible for human beings, because also such products often contain poisonous chemical substances, which are carcinogenic and otherwise often impair the organism and thus cause suffering and diseases. Therefore, it is urgently recommended that all widespread and commercially available chemical disinfectants and cosmetics should be avoided, because the toxins they contain are effectively very harmful to health. Many such everyday products contain dangerous chemical antimicrobial agents, not only in toothpastes and shampoos and skin creams, but also in deodorants, mouthwashes, liquid soaps, and in large quantities also in cosmetics, whereby especially the cosmetic toxins cause various types of cancer. Furthermore, chemical toxins are also contained in antimicrobial textiles, as well as in plastic kitchen utensils, such as plastic cutting boards, which are scratched when cutting food and secrete tiny toxic plastic particles into the food, mix with it, and are eaten by human beings. These then burden the organism and produce suffering and disease. Depending on the energy and strength of the immune system and the concentration of chemical toxins contained in the products, the human being's organism becomes susceptible to dangerous bacteria and viruses. Countless ubiquitous industrially or manually produced products contain dangerous chemical toxins that are harmful to health, which also pass into the blood and, in the case of mothers, also contaminate the mother's milk, so that even babies, mainly in industrialized countries, but also in poor countries, absorb toxins and damage their organism and thus also the immune system, so that they become susceptible to bad bacteria and viruses right from the start. Viruses, bacteria, or other pathogens only have access to the organism of human beings if their immune system is not able to fight the attacking viral or bacterial enemies. This is precisely when the defense system is paralyzed, weakened, or completely overridden. This means, however, that it is not the germ or pathogen itself that is the actual cause of an illness, a plague or simply a possible disease, but rather the inability of the immune system to defend itself against the attack of the bacteria or viruses and to eliminate them. If, therefore, there is an immune deficiency, then it must be countered by rebuilding the immune system in an appropriate way, which is only possible through the intake of suitable food and corresponding separate additives, as these are often mistakenly frowned upon by medical experts as useless and superfluous food supplements, although especially these minerals. Trace elements and vitamins correspond to the necessary building materials for a well-functioning immune system and are of unavoidable necessity and also form the fuel for muscles, nerves, and brain. Basically, there are about 50 nutrients that human beings need to consume through food in order to stay really healthy. In this respect, the most important sources of energy are carbohydrates, which are found in starch and sugar. Special and indispensable energy suppliers are also fats, which not only cushion the body and also the internal organs, but also form the material for the elastic sheaths of the cells. The protein in food is the material for the entire organism, which is needed to build up and maintain everything necessary for the body, including muscles, skin, hair, and hormones, but especially immune cells. The human being must therefore take in vitamins and minerals, and not in small quantities, as is claimed according to false assessments by medical and various other experts, as well as alleged nutrition experts, etc., due to ignorance or due to assumptions. All forms of vitamins and many minerals as well as trace elements are essential and thus absolutely necessary for life. However, if these substances are not supplied to the organism, even though the human being is dependent on them for his life, then the immune system is impaired, weakened, and loses its energy and strength to defend itself against germs that attack the organism as disease-causing bacteria and viruses. Whether the body is supplied with the necessary substances of various kinds as solid or liquid food, or separately as so-called food supplements is not important. But it is only important that the body can absorb all the necessary substances because it cannot produce them itself, apart from a few. Among the natural foods, special attention should be paid to those that can fight and kill bacilli or bacteria and naturally act like antibiotics, strengthen the immune system, and possibly also ward off viruses, such as maple syrup berries, foods containing iron spices, ginger honey, garlic cabbage herbs, turmeric nuts, mushroom seeds, licorice foods containing vitamin C onions, etc. These natural products play a particularly important role for a good and valuable immune system function, in addition to all the other diverse substances that human beings need for their life and existence. Secondary plant substances should also be mentioned, which officially do not belong to the group of nutrients, but correspond to substances which, however, have many health-promoting effects. If the strength of a germ or pathogen is considered, bacterium or virus, then it is to be understood that this cannot be influenced, because only the good, healthy, and energetic state of the immune system can do this. Any medicines which are directed against an ailment or disease and are effective or curative in this respect are equivalent to remedies directed against the effects of bacteria, viruses, and other germs. These medicines do not directly attack the pathogens, but in fact only alleviate the organic complaints caused by the pathogens on the one hand, while on the other hand they have a strengthening effect on the immune system and build up its energy and strength. In this way, the immune defenses are strengthened anew and again become effective in repelling and combating the germs of disease, and this as a rule until recovery and beyond. The fact is that when the immune system is weakened, this is due to lack of food and lack of all necessary substances of all kinds. Then it is no longer able to provide defense against disease germs entering the organism. A weakness of the body's defense system can also have other different causes, such as alcohol addiction, amalgam in teeth, equal sign mercury, fear of viruses and bacteria, lack of exercise, chronic conditions or diseases, intestinal complaints, drug addiction, wrong diet, toxins in the organism body, lack of sunlight, lack of vital substances, constant nerve stress, nervousness, psychological stress of all kinds, overwork, lack of sleep stress, etc. Supplying the entire organism with effective vital substances is of vital importance, whereby these can certainly be taken as so-called food supplements. Note Billy. It should be noted, however, that caution is advised with such products, because they are used in a shady way and are sold by criminals and dishonest companies at overpriced prices, and are also useless because such fake products often contain only dextrose or even dangerous substances, as a result of which the search for proven vital substances can be difficult. If also only some rules of the vital substance requirement are not observed, the immune system can already be damaged, and bacteria, viruses, and other disease germs can open the way into the organism. Therefore, it is necessary to pay attention to a correct diet that builds up the immune system. The fact is that human beings who live in rural areas and thus lessen the crowdedness of cities have a much stronger immune system than city human beings. The latter are usually anxious to live as free as possible from germs that can multiply, which is why they also consume more industrial food than human beings living in rural areas, who are less anxious in this way and eat more fresh food. They are also far more exposed to countless bacteria or viruses than city dwellers. But this strengthens their immune system because they go out into the fresh air, work in gardens, take walks in the forest or through meadows, etc., and eat more vigorous and vital food. They also indulge in relaxation and recreation in the open air and therefore do not need to do sports in cities and their catchment areas polluted with toxic gases and fumes, etc. In the countryside, the air in the open air is usually negatively ionized and thus refreshing and healthier than in the large villages and cities, where the air is positively ionized right into the home and thus difficult to breathe, polluting and unhealthy. But before I come to your questions, I have to say that in the case of any health problems, ailments and diseases, etc., the opinion must not prevail that vital substances alone would solve all health problems that occur. For this can absolutely not be the case, which is why, in any case, if the need arises, a visit to the doctor must be considered. Neither effective natural food nor the intake of pure vital substances of all kinds, as well as food supplements, can prevent a necessary visit to the doctor under certain circumstances. Every human being must be aware of this, at least in the case of an acute illness. Consequently, it is also necessary to act accordingly. However, as far as your questions are concerned, I will now comment on them and explain a few things. With regard to the disinfection of hands and body, it is to be said that we have found that certain doctors, physicians, virologists, immunologists, as well as epidemic specialists, etc., recommend hand disinfection with chemical disinfectants to the population, which corresponds to a decidedly irresponsible misadvice and health-endangering request. This is because such an encouraging recommendation corresponds to false advice that is harmful to health because, on the one hand, the effect of antibacterial disinfectants is only short-lived, and on the other hand, the bacteria and viruses disinfected from the hands are replaced by new ones after only a few minutes. And this happens in every normal environment, in every household, and everywhere else where there is no need for such disinfections. Such disinfection measures are only justified in rooms that need to be strictly disinfected and in places such as clinics and medical practices, etc. Chemical hand disinfection is therefore appropriate and necessary only in medical areas, such as surgery, wound treatment, dentistry, obstetrics, treatment of epidemics, and the like. Certain chemical disinfections are also justified in infected premises for walls and floors, etc., depending on the nature of the viruses or bacteria to be controlled. In any case, however, such chemical agents should be avoided, and only high-percentage distillation products made from natural raw materials should be used for disinfection. In the case of viruses, which do not correspond to any living organism, but only to an organic structure, so that they cannot be killed, their period of existence or existence time must be taken into account. That is to say, how long they are able to survive outside a host before they become paralyzed and die off, or their reactivity ceases and they are dissolved. The same applies to bacteria, which, however, can die as living organisms, whereby both with these and with viruses, with regard to their control by chemical disinfectants, etc., their period of existence must also be taken into account. Effectively, different germs, bacteria and viruses, survive for different lengths of time, whereby cool temperatures around 5 degrees Celsius, as well as lower temperatures and often also high air humidity, are very good conditions for many bacteria and viruses. How long germs like bacteria really survive, viruses survive depends on various other factors. For example, bacteria need a nutrient medium, like saliva or mucus, etc. But the survival time also depends on the surface structure of the germs themselves, but also on the place and its surface on which they have settled. This is also true for viruses, whose shell does not protect them and which, as lifeless organic structural forms, require different conditions than bacteria. The differences in these conditions are great. For example, an influenza virus only has a short average survival time of 2 days and is particularly sensitive to environmental influences. Its envelope offers it no protection, as I explained, because this virus, In contrast to a noro or rotavirus, for example, which have an envelope all around and can exist for up to 7 days, is only so-called enveloped, and therefore very susceptible to environmental influences. But the skin of human beings is a good carrier for the virus. The longer the survival time of a germ is, whereby not all germs that adhere to surfaces are also pathogens, the more potential the risk is for the human being to become infected by it, whereby, however, infection is not automatic, but only occurs when a surface is touched on which pathogens adhere, such as on objects, hands and bodies, and during intimate acts, etc. However, whether a disease actually develops from this depends on various factors, such as, firstly and most importantly, the current state and defense capacity of the immune system, but also the quantity of germs, etc. Bacteria and all kinds of germs settle on inanimate surfaces and adhere to them, such as handrails, grab rails, abortions, objects that often have to be touched, and of course on the hands of human beings, whereby the germs are then naturally transferred when they are touched. Under bad conditions, various bacteria also form so-called spores, which fall into a coma state, from which they then only awaken to life again after weeks, months, or even years, millennia, or even centuries or millions of years, when improved and suitable conditions arise in the environment, whereby they then revive. In this way, for example, epidemics and pandemics of epidemics could be caused and break out again, which were already rampant years, decades, centuries, millennia, or even millennia or many millions of years earlier. In their new phase of life, these bacterial offspring are then able to change and produce new genetic variations, as is also the case with viruses, which have similar abilities to survive, but this is unknown to the earthly sciences dealing with these factors, as is much else. What is known to them, however, relates to the fact of the existence of the individual microbiome, which, as the totality of all vital microorganisms is constantly exchanged among Earth humans as a completely normal process, does not cause illness and even trains the immune system. Nevertheless, it can of course happen that it also encounters a pathogen in the process. Therefore, there is also a need in this respect for thorough hand washing with good soap, and also to prevent the transmission of infections. So it is now clear that germs can survive certain viruses and bacteria from seconds or minutes to hours, days, weeks, months, or even numerous years to millions of years, if the necessary conditions are met. What applies to the use of chemical disinfectants for clinics and other medical places, etc., should really only be done in these ways. While all private hand disinfection and hygiene care, etc., with chemical disinfectants are absolutely unnecessary and moreover harmful and should be refrained from, just as the disinfection of utensils in the household is superfluous and should be refrained from. Disinfection with chemical agents should only be carried out on floors, toilets, lavatories, and other places, door handles, walkways, railings, window handles, and other disinfection that is necessary. Chemical disinfectants are extremely harmful to the sensitive skin of human beings, as are also too many chemical hygiene agents. The alcohols and other substances contained in disinfectants, which are toxic to the skin and the organism as a whole, cause skin irritation on the one hand, and inevitably also destroy the protective film of the skin. This makes it extremely susceptible to harmful bacteria and viruses. Depending on the time of year, such agents may also cause the hands to dry out, as can be the case with chemical disinfectants in particular, whereby these agents can also lead to chapped or even bloody hands. If the skin becomes irritated in this way, then regenerative measures must inevitably be taken. For example, by rubbing in healing ointments, such as cortisone creams, etc., in order to achieve a healing effect, which, however, can usually take months to heal. Simply washing hands with unsuitable soaps can attack, damage, and possibly destroy the protective layer of the skin. However, Chemical disinfectants and unsuitable soaps do not only damage the hands or the body, but their toxic substances also penetrate through the pores of the skin into the inside of the body and thus into the entire organism, causing suffering, diseases, and also various forms of cancer, as has already been explained. Antibacterial disinfectants are absolutely and in any case harmful when used for skin disinfection, because the skin is inevitably severely strained by the use of such products, making it susceptible to bacteria and viruses in the long run. Consequently, exactly the opposite happens what basically wants to be achieved. Therefore, if there is a contagious disease or epidemic, hand hygiene and overall body hygiene requires special attention, which is why it is fundamentally wrong to use toxins for disinfection. Consequently, when ignorant doctors, immunologists, virologists, physicians, esotericists, health freaks, and other believers recommend the allegedly safe use of chemical disinfectants, then this corresponds to an irresponsibility beyond compare. This is precisely because the use of such chemical agents damages the health of human beings, often to the point of irreparability. Even the tiniest quantity of a poisonous substance administered to the organism triggers a harmful effect on health, and this is also the case when it is an additive to a medicine. If, therefore, as is customary with earthly health control authorities, certain small quantities of poisonous substances in foodstuffs are allowed as harmless and permissible, then this corresponds to a conscienceless irresponsibility that despises human lives. It is not uncommon in this respect, as we have seen, that such authorizations are granted in ignorance of the facts, but also by means of secret agreements and bribes. The fact that enormous quantities of chemical disinfectants are produced and propagated as very useful and as a safe means of protection for human beings against the contagion of diseases and epidemics leads to their careless misuse and to much suffering and illness among the human beings who use these products. The doctors, immunologists, health freaks, virologists, physicians and esotericists, etc., who recommend chemical disinfectants, in their unknowingness, simple-mindedness, and improvidence, give well-intentioned advice and recommendations, but as a result of their failure to seek the truth about their false advice, they are irresponsibly guilty of damaging the health of those seeking advice. As far as the manufacturers and sellers of chemical disinfectants are concerned, they only care about the commercial benefit. Consequently, they only want to optimize their financial profit. In doing so, they do not give any thought to what the harmful consequences for the health of the users of these products will be. Because as producers and sellers of harmful chemical agents, they are not interested in this. So the fact is, as you always say in such conversations, that the producers of any harmful products, as well as their sellers, only want to earn themselves unconscionably stupid. And this applies to the producers of chemical disinfectants, as well as to all the sales outlets that sell these harmful products to the public, to special shops that specialize in them, as well as to medical shops such as pharmacies and drugstores. And the fact that human beings who are concerned about their personal health and that of their family members, and who want to protect themselves and their loved ones from infection, can become even more at risk of falling ill as a result of the chemical disinfectants they are being persuaded to use, is neither considered nor explained. And so many human beings use harmful toxic agents in everyday life in order to be germ-free, without knowing that this makes them even more susceptible to viruses and bacteria, and that they may fall ill, because they do not know that by using antibacterial disinfectants or other unsuitable cleaners for the hands and the body, they are virtually opening the way to disaster. It is necessary to warn against these products, because many of them are poisonous and harmful to health and, apart from causing allergies, can also cause very dangerous ailments and diseases, even irreparable cancerous ulcers. Causes are toxins, especially alcohols. corrosive acids or chlorine, etc., and all these and other toxic substances can not only irritate the skin, but even damage it permanently and also cause organic suffering and diseases. The use of antibacterial chemical disinfectants in private homes for hand disinfection or any form of personal hygiene, as well as in private households for the general and unnecessary disinfection of the home and its contents, is strongly discouraged. For household disinfection can only be of use when a large number of persons go in and out of the home and use all the facilities which, for reasons of hygiene and cleanliness as well as for health reasons, require daily and thorough cleaning and care. Excessive hygiene, however, is much more harmful than useful, because above all, the immune system is affected and weakened by chemical disinfectants. The immune system resists, but the more it is affected by disinfectants, the more it loses energy and strength until it collapses and finally fails completely. In a normal state, the immune system is never idle and works in a very significant way to remain energetically powerful, but this is unknown to the relevant earthly sciences. The phenomenon in this respect is that the immune system is constantly training itself by being in contact with good and important bacteria that invigorate the organism and by fighting mock battles with them, even though they do not correspond to any disease germs. The whole procedure in this respect is completely peaceful and is intended on the one hand to keep the immune system alert and on the other hand to maintain its defenses and power. There.
Excuse me, this is something new to my knowledge, which is why I'm getting an idea of how I might interpret what you're explaining regarding mock fighting. Can I perhaps see this as, for example, two fundamentally peaceful but different human beings, belonging to different races but having a common language but fundamentally different levels of knowledge and interests, peacefully converging on each other to assert themselves?
You never cease to amaze me with your ability to combine and your logical interpretation with similes. For your presentation in this respect corresponds to what is effectively to be understood with regard to what I have explained. And the whole of this fact is just as important and of great significance for strengthening the immune system, as are also all the necessary vital substances of which the whole organism requires and through which the immune system also gains energy and strength. So to strengthen the immune system, it is also necessary for the immune system to be able to deal with germs in order to strengthen itself in this way and to be able to defend itself against germs in order to avoid suffering and disease. In a clean and healthy household, there are normally no pathogenic bacteria, but only good and harmless ones, which the immune system nevertheless uses to deal with them in a training way in order to stay energetically and powerfully in shape. And these bacteria are of a completely different kind than germs of disease. Consequently, they also do not have to be fought with aggressive chemical substances and antibacterial disinfectants or cleaners. It is also a fact, as we have found in many earthly households according to our investigations over decades, that in those in which chemical disinfectants and antibacterial cleaners are used often or even daily, the inhabitants of all ages are more susceptible to bad bacteria and viruses and also show more suffering and illness than inhabitants of other households in which such agents are not used or are used only moderately in a necessary way. According to our findings and knowledge, this evil results from the fact that bad bacteria or germs in such households come into constant contact with chemical disinfectants and antibacterial cleaning agents as a result of their misuse, and consequently become resistant to the poisonous active ingredients of the disinfectants and antibacterial cleaning agents.
Thank you for your comments, which are quite instructive. But it would probably be good if you could now explain something about hygiene, hand washing, and hand disinfection. Hand hygiene, which was introduced to midwives by the Hungarian gynecologist and assistant doctor Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna between 1846 and 1849, put an end to the great deaths among women in labor. As an obstetrician, Semmelweis found the reason why women in childbed always got puerperal fever or high fever and an infection and died of it, which was like an epidemic and commonplace at that time, and was called death of women from men's hands. So he introduced hand hygiene, hand washing and the measure of hand disinfection with chlorinated lime, whereby this new hygiene measure worked wonders, so to speak, and became the standard in medicine, literally saving human lives ever since. Semmelweis, however, was not rewarded for this by his colleagues with recognition, but with open hostility, as has always been the case, and is also the case today when something new is brought, explained, said, revealed, or taught that is incomprehensible, fantastic, or simply novel to others and is not accepted. Well, correct hand hygiene therefore means human health, although a certain amount of know-how is necessary, which also became clear to Ignaz Semmelweis when he recognized the fatal and causal connections between the unclean hands of midwives and doctors, who treated women in childbed with dirty hands and whose touch caused infections, whereby at that time there was often cadaveric poison on the hands of midwives and doctors. Through hand disinfection, the mortality rate in his department fell sensationally fast, while in the other departments the infections and the deaths of the women in childbed continued unabated. Ignaz Semmelweis was thus the real pioneer of hand disinfection. But unfortunately his life ended tragically, because in 1865, at the age of 47, he died near Vienna in an insane asylum from blood poisoning he had contracted during an operation. That's what I wanted to have said.
That's good information, my friend. It is worth mentioning, Edward. Then I will now explain the following. What is still to be explained with regard to hand washing and hand disinfection, I will explain in simple terms as follows: shaking hands during greetings, touching the sick or the dead, pressing door handles, using any kind of retaining rings or holding bars, or touching all kinds of other things which are also frequently touched or used by all kinds of persons with their hands, are normally contaminated with a very high number of bacteria, viruses, yeasts, fungi, and other microorganisms. On the one hand, there are up to 10 million bacteria and all kinds of germs on and in the skin of the hands, of which various ailments and diseases can be caused. For this reason, it is necessary to maintain good hand hygiene. That is to say, to wash and clean the hands for the sake of health and to carry out natural hand disinfection, which should never be done with chemical disinfectants, but only with natural agents that are kind to the skin and health, which in private use are the most significant and important substances in the prevention of infections. Unfortunately, it is a fact that many Earth humans, in spite of knowing the importance of hand hygiene, do not observe it to the proper extent, although the hands are the most important vehicle for the transmission of germs and can themselves cause infections in the lungs, urinary tract, and wounds. Hand hygiene is therefore one of the most important measures for preventing infections, not only in institutions, clinics and medical facilities, etc., where particularly thorough disinfection is of great importance, but also in the private sphere, although simpler forms of hygiene and disinfection are used in this respect. Differences in hand hygiene exist in the areas of the public, the body, the private sphere, the environment, as well as various medical facilities, workplaces, and travel facilities, etc., all of which require special attention and treatment with regard to disinfectants and cleaning agents. So, for example, hand hygiene in medical facilities is fundamentally different from hand hygiene in the purely private physical sphere, as well as in everyday life, at work and other occasions, etc. However, the basic rule for hand hygiene is that after washing hands, no chemical hand disinfection with appropriate disinfectants is carried out, but at most, a natural skincare cream is used and rubbed in thoroughly. Thorough hand washing can be done with liquid or solid, as well as completely natural hand soap, which is fully part of hand cleansing and neither irritates nor damages the skin. As an all-natural product, Such soaps are not usually antibacterial, but they can also be naturally antibacterial depending on the application, with both forms usually removing all germs from the skin of the hands. It should be noted that regular hand washing is necessary before eating and after using a lavatory. As a rule, hand disinfection with a chemical disinfectant is neither necessary nor appropriate to protect against infection with germs, because natural suitable toilet soaps are fully sufficient for the correct and germ-free cleaning of the hands. These are colonized again with new bacteria only a short time after washing, which cannot be prevented even by the use of toxic disinfectants, because the hands, like the entire body, are naturally colonized with around 100 trillion bacteria and must be so in order to be viable at all. In medical facilities and buildings, such as clinics and surgeries, etc., simple hand cleaning with purely natural means is not sufficient. However, because dangerous germs occur much more frequently in such places than in private rooms, households, or on the streets, due to the activities of the persons there. On the other hand, persons in hospitals, etc., are particularly susceptible to infections and are therefore at risk to their health. Human beings who are in good health and live in their own homes usually have an intact immune system, so they can also fight and ward off harmful bacteria and viruses with simple and natural household remedies. As a rule, a simple, thorough hand hygiene is sufficient for them. So washing with good, natural, and skin-friendly soaps and other natural cleansing agents with or without natural antibacterial additives is quite useful and absolutely sufficient. A special disinfection of the hands does not bring a more thorough cleaning, and moreover also no benefit. But on the contrary, health damages, consequently, for example, skin dehydration, cracked hands, itching, and thinness up to bleeding of the hands, as well as pain, can occur. This, while various toxins of the chemical disinfectants inevitably penetrate through the skin pores under the skin and into the organism, where they sooner or later cause health-damaging mischief up to irreparable suffering, diseases, and ulcers such as cancer. Hand hygiene does not correspond to simply washing hands with water, because this false massive hand washing only has an extremely reduced effect. The use of a chemical disinfectant for hand hygiene is also null and void, and this is also the case if it is used after a successful hand washing. Then it may leave fewer germs on the hands, but it only works for a very short time and quickly allows new germs to reappear and thus offers no permanent protection. Hand disinfection after thorough professional hand washing is not useful and is not part of perfect hand hygiene. Hand disinfection after professional hand washing only makes sense under certain and significant circumstances, such as in medical and surgical areas, when dealing with sick, weakened, very young or old human beings, in healthcare, in acute epidemic and pandemic prophylaxis, etc. So there is a big difference between private hygienic hand disinfection and surgical hand disinfection. Because in the private sphere it is nonsensical unless there is a special and specific need for it, whereas in the surgical sphere the health safety of human beings depends on it. So in the normal case, for persons in the private sphere, there is no need whatsoever for relevant hygienic hand disinfection with chemical and harmful agents in everyday life. Disinfection of hands with chemical agents after a thorough washing of the same with suitable natural substances, such as appropriate soaps, sand, or plants, etc., is absolutely not necessary, but care of the hands with suitable toxin-free natural creams can be beneficial in some ways. Frequent washing and disinfecting of the hands is nonsensical and dangerous to health, so it is irresponsible if it is nevertheless recommended for private use from a false medical point of view. But especially also for commercial reasons when product manufacturers, pharmacies, drugstores, shops, and mail-order companies propagate and sell chemical disinfectants of many kinds. It is also irresponsible when health organizations, etc., recommend or prescribe chemical disinfectants and similar care products for optimal hand hygiene, which in principle place a heavy burden on the hands and generally on the skin and may damage it, as well as inevitably releasing toxins into the organism through the pores, thus promoting suffering and illness. It may be necessary, for example, to thoroughly wash the hands after performing certain tasks without using chemicals, and to apply suitable natural hand creams that replenish the skin's oils in order to avoid the risk of the skin cracking. This, while the use of alcoholic or chemical hand disinfectants sooner or later causes damage to health, which eventually becomes a torment. Chemical hygiene wipes, antibacterial gels and disinfectant sprays, etc., which are propagated as germ killers and which contain all the usual disinfectants, are privately used by the majority of humanity in large quantities several times a day as a result of conscious and also unconscious misinformation and false recommendations. But the repeated daily use has exactly the opposite effect of what is promised by the manufacturers and sellers and hoped for by the users. Namely, because the use of such chemical products is harmful in the long run, be it disinfectants, care products, or cosmetics. When it comes to disease-causing germs such as bacteria and viruses, fear and terror prevail among the majority of mankind because no authoritative explanations and information reach them. And this is not because the whole of commerce prevents this in order not to suffer a collapse in profit margins. Thus, the bulk of mankind is not given a chance to learn the effective truth, to inform themselves and to act rationally according to it, which is the necessity for keeping the whole body healthy. This fact really promotes the obsession note, Billy. Obsession or compulsive action, and the urge of the majority of the naive Earth humans to put an end to all the vital, disgusting bacilli, bacteria, microbes, and other germs and living beings inhabiting the body up to 100 trillion. Effectively, it is also completely wrong and imprudent to carry out disinfection rituals several times a day, because these do not contribute to healthy hygiene and hand care, but on the contrary to health damage, which not only makes itself felt irritably, note Billy, through agitation, irritation, but also leads to irreparability. Note Billy, non-reparation, impossibility of healing. Therefore, chemical disinfectants should be used in the private sphere absolutely only in exceptional cases and in the case of effectively important necessity. Chemical disinfectant gels correspond to anything but natural skin protection agents and skin care products, but rather to a danger of skin damage and organic ailments and diseases, which absolutely should not be underestimated. The toxic additives in chemical disinfectants, as they are often added to all kinds of cosmetics, can on the one hand damage the natural skin flora, but on the other hand they contribute significantly to illnesses, because they penetrate into the organism through the skin pores and thus open the way for pathogens instead of protecting it. Allergic skin reactions and eczema can also be caused quickly or over time, which then results in the skin becoming cracked, chapped, red, dry, itchy, and painful, as well as permeable to germs such as bad bacteria. In addition, as cannot be mentioned often enough, as soon as the effect of the disinfectant used has disappeared, which only takes a few minutes, the harmful substances penetrate unhindered through the pores of the skin into the organism, and also new harmful germs settle on the skin. Furthermore, and this is the most important factor, any chemical disinfectant application destroys the good and vital bacteria that should actually protect the skin. Particularly insidious are chemical disinfectants, gels, and deodorants that contain the very strong and toxic active ingredient triclosan, as I explained earlier. This has a very damaging effect on the endocrine system, as it also triggers allergies and is always a danger of poisoning for human beings. Triclosan is also a very strong poison that kills bacteria, but might also neutralize odors. But sooner or later, when this poison is used against certain bacteria, it immunizes them and makes them multi-resistant, and thus the poison becomes useless and resistant against germs. and thus no longer effective, as is also the case with other poisons and also with antibiotics, against which bacteria become immune in the course of time. Disinfectants should be utilized in the home for certain necessary disinfections, such as toilets, etc., which are frequently used by various persons in everyday life and also at night. But in general, for the hands and body, any use with such agents should be dispensed with. As far as the necessary and unavoidable use of disinfectants is concerned, their efficacy as well as their active ingredients and concentration are important, as are the conditions of their use. In addition, the exposure time under certain circumstances, the temperature must also be taken into account, so that proper application can only be beneficial if such products are used under precisely prescribed and defined conditions. It is also important to ensure that when disinfectants are used, appropriate hand gloves and respiratory masks are worn, no toxic vapors are inhaled, and no disinfectants are swallowed. Otherwise, there is a risk of serious poisoning. Care must also be taken to ensure that disinfectants do not enter nature, its fauna and flora, and also watercourses. Otherwise, the environment will be widely poisoned. This, Edouard, dear friend, is fundamentally what was important to explain and partly also to repeat over and over again.
Tremendous thanks, dear friend. But you know, Ptah, perhaps the whole thing should be briefly stated again in summary, if you will please do so and still have time.
I can do that in a really short way and repeat everything again in its entirety, if you think that this must be necessary, because you want to make our conversation public. Because the whole of the explanations will only be understood and reasoned by the Earth humans if the same facts are repeatedly addressed and repeated again and again. So I will briefly explain everything again in another way. Hygiene cleaners as well as chemical disinfectants of all kinds pollute the environment and the health of human beings very strongly. In addition, germs become more resistant and even immune through the use of chemical disinfectants, which also makes them more and more difficult to fight and eliminate in hospitals, old people's homes, and nursing homes. Chemical disinfectant household cleaners also cause many evils, irritating the skin, respiratory tract, eyes, and throat. Their use alone might make them dangerous because they pollute indoor air and affect the overall physical and immune development of children, as well as promote allergies in them. The less children come into contact with microorganisms, the less their immune system has the opportunity to learn to build up energy and strength, and thus defenses against germs. The less it has to deal with microorganisms, the weaker and steadily more susceptible it becomes to suffering and disease. As is also the case with adult human beings, although the latter are less susceptible because they no longer have an immune system that first has to develop. Basically, from the point of view of health and as a result of the perception of responsibility with regard to one's own body and the entire inner organism, as well as with regard to one's fellow human beings and the entire environment, the use of chemical products which are sold on Earth under the following names should be avoided: disinfectant, antibacterial, hygienic, biocide, antimicrobial, and bactericide, etc., because they all contain various kinds of toxic substances that are harmful to health. For the simple household of a simple flat, any exaggerated hygiene and sterility through the use of chemical disinfectants is absolutely superfluous. Because for light soiling in a normal household with about 3 to 5 persons, the use of ecological cleaning agents is quite sufficient. If, however, there are more persons, then disinfection of various things can also be considered, whereby the chemical of such agents should not, according to understanding, be implemented with actual chemistry, but with distillery or distillery agent, by which high-percentage alcohol-based disinfection products are to be understood. And when in my explanations and statements I have always spoken of chemical disinfectants and, in the same way, of cosmetics, then by this term effectively only chemical products are to be understood, precisely chemical disinfectants and cosmetics. which are not to be used but should otherwise be replaced by high-percentage distillery products, namely with at least 70% disinfectant alcohol cleansers made from any berries, fruits, or herbs. Microfiber cloths can also do a good job, and such simple means can be of much use and reduce the introduction and multiplication of possible germs. Normal hand washing with a suitable, natural, good soap alone effectively reduces the occurrence of bad bacteria and other microorganisms, which, like the majority of all viruses and bad bacteria, are transmitted from human being to human being through the hands, as is also the case with much else that is touched with them. Furthermore, spreading an infection also occurs through breathing and speaking alone, whereby expiratory droplets are excreted and spread, which corresponds to a biohazard. Because these bioaerosol excretions from the mouth and respiratory organ of other human beings enter the mouth, the respiratory organ, and the eyes, thereby causing infection. But viruses and bacteria are also carried by feet and shoes and taken up again by the human beings, especially when they enter the house via doormats, take off their shoes, and walk around with bare feet above and in the flat. Especially doormats and carpets in the home are virus and bacteria catchers that need frequent good cleaning, for which, as for many other things, suitable, gentle chemical products are suitable, although the best recommendation is that of a high and at least 70% distilled solution, that is to say, an alcohol made from fruits, berries, or herbs. Alcohol for disinfecting is effectively useful, but it must not be used in its pure form. Of course, it must also not be drunk, but must be mixed with 30% water, just depending on how strong the distillation product is distilled. The alcohol must therefore have at least 70% by volume as a disinfectant note. Billy. Percent by volume means the content of pure ethanol or pure alcohol in order to be able to penetrate the cell wall of bacteria and thus destroy them from the inside, so that too low a dose of alcohol makes disinfection impossible. It is also necessary to know that alcohol is not suitable for disinfecting wounds, but causes damage, burning pain, and inhibits healing. In hospitals, surgeries, and nursing homes, it is unfortunately not possible to do without hand disinfection, because the risk of infecting already weakened patients or residents of homes and other institutions with bacteria or viruses is very high and can result in the introduction of life-threatening germs and thus cause illness. In contrast, in normal everyday life, it is not necessary to disinfect the hands in any special way, because in the purely private sphere, normal and natural hygiene care is absolutely sufficient for healthy human beings, so that any disinfectants are absolutely superfluous. Basically, water and good soaps are completely sufficient and are able to remove significant germs and bacteria and keep the naturally existing microorganisms of the skin flora and the skin as a stable ecosystem in balance. So there is no need for excessive cleansing, and especially no need for pathogenic disinfection, because any natural and good cleansing is sufficient. While any disinfection kills the healthy germs that form the actual protective acid mantle on the skin, maintain it and thus protect it from harmful influences. The protective acid mantle also protects the skin from drying out, as well as from germs, while disinfectants disturb and destroy the skin's natural balance. This is because such chemical agents kill the bacteria and fungi that are extremely important for skin health, as well as causing allergies, eczema, and skin diseases, and, when they get into the environment, for example, in sewage treatment plants, they cause mischief when they get into wastewater and disrupt the interaction of bacterial strains or even prevent water purification.
Thank you. It was certainly good. Again, briefly add something to all the many and valuable explanations so it will be remembered.
If you say so, I guess it will be. However, now, Edward, I must go.
Good. Then I do not want to add anything more, and yes, that's still pending, what I asked regarding the big epidemics. but if you have to go, then I can look on the internet to see if there is a corresponding list that I can copy out and then add to our conversation. However, it is likely that the information contained therein will not be correct.
That will be so, but perhaps they will give some idea of what happened in those old days. But now I really must go my way. Farewell, Edouard. Goodbye.
You too, Ptah. Farewell, and thanks again for your explanations. Goodbye.
Diseases that cause epidemics and pandemics. Plague or disease, pathogen, description.
Pest, bacterium, Yersinia pestis, the plague, Latin pestis, plague, epidemic, Greek also loimos, also called pestilence, Latin pestilentia, in antiquity, is a highly contagious infectious disease. Originally, the disease is a zoonosis, that is to say a disease transmissible from animals to human beings and vice versa, which came from rodents, marmots, rats, squirrels. Transmission to human beings is classically via the bite of an infected flea, but direct human-to-human infection via droplet infection is also possible. Treatment of an infection is possible with antibiotics, although resistance is increasingly being observed. English sweat and non-English sweat, also English sweating sickness. English sweating fever or English sweating addiction, Latin, pestis sudorosa or Suda anglicus, was a very contagious disease of unclear etiology and of unclear origin, trigger, usually fatal, which occurred in the 15th and 16th centuries in 5 epidemic waves, mainly in England, and then apparently disappeared again. The disease was characterized by a very short incubation period and a high lethality rate. Often only a few hours passed between the appearance of the first symptoms and the onset of death. A typical symptom was profuse sweating, which gave the disease its name. Syphilis bacterium treponema pallidum SSP. Pallidum syphilis, also called loose venerea, hard chancre or French disease maladie française, is a chronic infectious disease belonging to the group of sexually transmitted diseases. Syphilis is transmitted mainly during sexual acts through mucosal contact and exclusively from human beings to human beings. During pregnancy and childbirth, an infected mother can infect her child syphilis connata. The appearance of the disease is varied. Typical is an onset with painless mucosal ulcers and swelling of the lymph nodes. Some of those infected develop a chronic course, which is characterized by multiple skin and organ infestations. In the final stage, the central nervous system is destroyed. Syphilis is curable through the administration of antibiotics, including penicillin. Pox virus, orthopox virus, varioli, smallpox virus, pox or variola, also variola, Latin varioli, is the name of an infectious disease that is dangerous and life-threatening for human beings. Due to its high infectiousness and lethality, the disease is one of the most dangerous for human beings. Smallpox can be transmitted directly from human beings to human beings through droplet infection when coughing. In addition, infection can also occur through inhalation of dust, for example when shaking out clothes or blankets of people with smallpox. In contrast to chicken pox, the extremities and the face are more severely affected by the skin rash in smallpox. The incubation period is 1 to 2.5 weeks, but usually 12 to 14 days. At the onset of the disease, there is a severe feeling of illness, headache and backache with high fever and chills, and there is also pharyngitis. At this point, the patient is highly infectious. In smallpox, a biphasic course of fever is typical. After 1 to 5 days, the fever drops and rises again after 1 day. Now the typical skin symptoms appear. The purulent fluid in the pustule spreads a very unpleasant odor. In a less severe course of the disease, the pustules gradually dry up about 2 weeks after the onset of the disease, leaving behind clearly visible scars. In more severe cases, blindness, deafness, paralysis, brain damage and pneumonia can occur. The disease is often fatal. The estimated lethality of untreated smallpox is about 30%. Hemorrhagic fevers. Various viruses. Hemorrhagic fevers from ancient Greek alpha hema, German a blood, and ancient Greek iota rheinae, German etater, break, Old German term Blutbrechen fever, are severe infectious febrile diseases associated with bleeding. They are caused by viral infections, which is why they are also referred to as viral hemorrhagic fever (VHF). The causative agents of hemorrhagic fevers are native to all continents except Antarctica, but they usually occur in Africa, South America, or Southeast Asia. In Central Europe and North America, fatal HFVs are extremely rare. They are occasionally introduced by travelers who have been infected abroad. The cardiac sweating fever, unknown Picard sweating fever, is a historical infectious disease that occurred in France and Germany, among other countries. It first appeared in 1718 in Vimou in the northern French province of Picardy, after which it was named, and spread from Paris to Flanders. There were 194 epidemics by 1874, with the last occurrence in 1918. The disease has similarities to English sweat, but differs in symptoms and mortality. Symptoms included high fever and nosebleeds, as well as a skin rash. Many victims died within 2 days. Those who survived got better after about 7 days. Skin blisters usually appeared, which later dried and scaled. Fleck fever. Rickettsia prowazekii. Fleck fever. Also war plague, lice fever, louse fever, hospital fever or fowl fever is an infection with microorganisms bacteria that is transmitted by lice, especially the clothes louse, mites, ticks or fleas. The name spotted fever is derived from a symptom of the disease, a red spotted skin rash. The incubation period is 10 to 14 days. Then there may be a prodromal stage with chills, increasingly high fever, headache, pain in the limbs, and clouding of consciousness if the brain is also affected. Later, a blue to red spotted skin rash due to petechial hemorrhages is typical. Spotted fever favors further infections by other bacteria, so-called secondary infections. These include meningitis, inflammation of the brain, pneumonia, myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle. Bubonic plague. Bacteria. In bubonic plague, infection usually occurs through the bite of a rat flea, which carries the pathogen as an intermediate host. Through host switching, the bacterium is transmitted from an infected to a previously healthy food victim after it has multiplied in the flea. In addition to transmission from rat to rat flea to human being, there is also a transmission route from human being to human being via the human flea. The incubation period is a few hours to 7 days. The symptoms are fever, headache and pain in the limbs, a strong feeling of illness and drowsiness. Later, there are disturbances of consciousness. The name bubonic plague comes from the severely swollen, very painful bumps bubones, which can form a bundle of swollen lymph nodes of the secondary complex on the neck, armpits and groin axillary and inguinal bubones that result from infection of the lymph nodes and lymph vessels in the area of the flea bite. These bumps can reach a diameter of up to 10 centimeters and are blue-black in color due to internal bleeding in the lymph nodes. The growths disintegrate after they have fused with pus. Cholerobacterium vibrio cholerae cholera, bile flow. Name for the diarrheal disease, from Greek choled bile, also bile-breaking diarrhea, formerly also biliary dysentery, is a severe bacterial infectious disease mainly of the small intestine. The infection usually occurs through contaminated drinking water or infected food. The bacteria can cause extreme diarrhea and severe vomiting, which can lead to rapid desiccosis with loss of electrolytes. Although most infections, about 85%, are asymptomatic, the lethality at the onset of the disease is between 20 and 70% if untreated. Typhoid bacterium Salmonella enterica SSP. Enterica serovar typhoid fever or typhus abdominalis, also abdominal typhus, typhoid fever or enteric fever, is a systemic infectious disease. The course of the disease is mainly characterized by high fever. If left untreated, the disease can be dangerous and lead to death. Paratyphoid fever is a weakened form of typhoid fever whose causative agent is not Salmonella typhi but Salmonella paratyphi. Russian flu, viral influenza, possibly H3N8. The influenza pandemic of 1889 to 1895 was a worldwide influenza epidemic that was called Russian flu in newspapers at the time, and later also in professional literature. The pandemic began in Central Asia in the summer of 1889, from where it followed trade routes and spread to Russia, China, and from Russia to Europe and then worldwide. The spread occurred in waves. The first wave of 1889-1890 was followed by 3 more waves of varying severity until 1895. With up to 1 million victims worldwide, the Russian flu was the most severe influenza epidemic to date, surpassed only by the Spanish flu, which claimed well over 25 million victims from 1918 onwards. The illness was often short but severe, with fever, headache and pain in the limbs, nausea and vomiting, but occasionally also took a more protracted course with complications such as pneumonia. Because of its rapid course, often lasting only 3 days, the flu was also called Blitzkatarrh in German, which was also the name given to the Spanish flu in 1918-19. Within 4 months, the epidemic spread worldwide. Polioviruses, poliomyelitis Greek. Gray. Marrow, often also called polio for short, German spinal. Polio disease or Heinemedin disease is an infectious disease caused by polioviruses, predominantly in childhood. It affects motor neurons and remains asymptomatic in a large number of cases, but can also lead to severe, permanent paralysis. These often affect the extremities. Infestation of the respiratory muscles is fatal. This led to the first machine ventilation procedures. Even years after infection, the disease can reoccur. The virus is usually transmitted by smear infection, urine or stool, but droplet infections are also possible. It can only replicate in human beings and a few species of monkeys, and can only be transmitted from human to human. Spanish flu influenza virus 8 H1N1. The Spanish flu was an influenza pandemic caused by an unusually virulent derivative of the influenza virus subtype 8 H1N1 that spread in 3 waves between 1918 towards the end of World War I and 1920, claiming between 27 million and 50 million human lives out of a world population of about 1.8 billion. This means that more persons died from the Spanish flu than in the First World War, 17 million. A total of about 500 million people are said to have been infected, resulting in a lethality rate of 5 to 10%, which is significantly higher than that of diseases caused by other influenza pathogens. One special feature of the Spanish flu was that it mainly affected people between 20 and 40 years of age, whereas influenza viruses usually endanger small children and old human beings in particular. In 2005, the researchers involved succeeded in reconstructing the virus, which, in the opinion of the researchers involved, is directly descended from the bird flu virus and has acquired its dangerousness in only a few mutations. Because of this and because of the immensely increased human mobility since 1918, virologists have since increasingly warned of a new, possibly more dangerous pandemic. Asian flu influenza virus H2N2 Asian flu was the second worst influenza pandemic of the 20th century after Spanish flu. It was caused by the H2N2 influenza virus. The Asian flu broke out in 1957 and probably originated in the People's Republic of China. It is estimated that 1 to 2 million human beings worldwide fell victim to it in 1957 and 1958. The Asian flu was caused by a virus subtype that had developed from a combination of a human and an avian influenza virus antigenic shift. For prevention, gargling with hydrogen peroxide and taking tablets containing formalin were recommended at the time. H2N2 was easily transmissible from human beings to human beings and caused further influenza infections every year until 1968. H2N2 was then superseded by the H3N2 subtype. H3N2 caused the pandemic known as Hong Kong flu in 1968 and 1969. Anthrax Bacillus anthracis splenic fever, or anthrax, is an acute infectious disease caused by Bacillus anthracis that usually affects cloven-hoofed animals, but also other herbivorous animals. Humans can also be affected if they are exposed to anthrax spores, which can also be transmitted from animals to human beings. Transmission from human beings to humans is considered very unlikely. No such case has been documented to date. The causative agent of anthrax is an aerobic and spore-forming rod-shaped bacterium. The anthrax toxin produced by the pathogen is highly toxic. The spores may survive for decades or even centuries. Cutaneous anthrax is the most harmless form of anthrax. It is only transmitted through direct skin contact. If left untreated, 5 to 20% of cases are fatal. When infection occurs, a vesicle-lined ulcer with a black necrosis in the center forms at the site of transmission. A pus-filled vesicle develops from this. As the disease expands further, new vesicles appear. When these vesicles coalesce, a splenic gangrene develops, which, if it gets connected to a blood vessel, can lead to blood poisoning. Pulmonary anthrax for an outbreak of disease apparent infection, approximate. 3000 to 9000 anthrax spores must be inhaled with the breath, which adhere to animal skins or hairs and are still contagious after years. The incubation period is a few days to several weeks. The disease begins nonspecifically and flu-like with a cough, high fever, chills and shortness of breath follow. The coughed-up secretion is highly infectious. Even with immediate antibiotic therapy, the lethality death rate from pulmonary anthrax is very high, since a massive release of anthrax toxins has already taken place with the onset of symptoms. Death usually occurs within 3 to 6 days with the appearance of septic shock. Intestinal anthrax is transmitted by eating infected dairy products or infected meat. The incubation period is a few hours to 3 days. Bloody vomiting and bloody diarrhea occur, which are signs of a bloody intestinal infection. The germs spread throughout the body, blood poisoning and heart and kidney failure can occur. Over 50% of those who fall ill die. This is the rarest form of anthrax. If HIV virus is untreated, HIV infection usually leads to AIDS-acquired immunodeficiency syndrome after a latency period of varying length, usually several years without symptoms. The spread of HIV has developed into a pandemic since the early 1980s, which, according to estimates by the Joint United Nations Programme on HIV, AIDS UNAIDS, has claimed around 39 million lives to date. At the end of 2014, an estimated 36.9 million human beings worldwide were infected with HIV, with an equal distribution between the two sexes. Marburg fever virus is mainly transmitted through contact with body fluids, blood, stool, urine, saliva, breast milk, etc. Human-to-human transmission via aerosols appears to play a minor role in the spread in natural outbreaks. Inhalation of bat excreta as well as consumption of raw bat meat is considered the primary route of transmission from animal to human beings. After an incubation period that usually lasts 3 to 9 days, but no longer than 21 days, the first non-specific symptoms appear, which resemble the initial clinical pictures of malaria, typhoid, or yellow fever. These symptoms are severe, watery diarrhea, abdominal pain, vomiting, severe chest and lung pain, sore throat, and cough. In a high percentage of infected persons, the virus triggers high hemorrhagic fever 5 to 7 days after the onset of the disease, predominantly attacking the gastrointestinal tract and the lungs. Most of those infected also die within the latter time period, although no statistically significant correlation between the occurrence of hemorrhages and a fatal outcome of the disease has been demonstrated, especially as it has been shown that the resulting blood loss is not lethal. Yeast intestinal bacterium Escherichia coli, the pathogen, and the infectious diseases it causes occur worldwide. The main reservoir of the pathogen is ruminants, especially cattle, but also sheep and goats, in whose intestines they regularly occur without causing disease. The pathogens are mainly transmitted by direct or indirect oral ingestion of fecal traces. The pathogen can be ingested with food, especially raw meat or raw milk. Infection is also possible via drinking or bathing water contaminated with feces. Drinking water contaminated with animal excreta caused more than 2,000 illnesses and 18 deaths in Walkerton, Canada, in 2000. In addition, infection from human beings to human beings and transmission through animal-human contact are possible. Flies can be vectors of EHEC. Less than 100 bacteria can be enough to cause infection. An infection can be asymptomatic. Otherwise, after an incubation period of typically 3 to 4 days, but occasionally also after 2 to 10 days, gastroenteritis, gastrointestinal flu, vomiting, diarrhea occurs, which can develop into enterohemorrhagic colitis. The toxins destroy the cells of the intestinal wall and blood vessel walls, especially in the brain and kidneys. The excretion of the bacteria typically takes place over a period of 5 to 20 days, but can also extend over several months, especially in children. During this time, infection of other persons is possible. SARS-CoV-SARS coronavirus, SARS-associated coronavirus, scientifically severe acute respiratory syndrome-related coronavirus. SARS-CoV, formerly also SCV, is the causative agent of severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS. Avian influenza, influenza A virus H5N1. Avian influenza H5N1 is a viral disease of birds caused by the influenza A virus H5N1. In isolated cases, the viruses have been transmitted to mammals and human beings, and the disease is therefore a zoonosis. The incubation period of the H5N1 virus appears to be longer than the 2 to 3 days observed in a normal human influenza. Data published by the WHO indicate that the incubation period is between 2 and 8 days. However, cases with an incubation period of 17 days have also been described. Many patients with H5N1 infection developed pneumonia at an early stage. After the onset of the disease, the following flu-like signs have been regularly observed initially: extremely high fever, cough, shortness of breath, sore throat. Sometimes also diarrhea, more rarely abdominal pain and vomiting. In the further course of the disease, very often pneumonia, stomach complaints, intestinal complaints, elevation of liver values, strong reduction of leukocytes, leukopenia, strong reduction of erythrocytes, anemia, strong reduction of thrombocytes, thrombocytopenia. Occasionally, patients also developed kidney weakness, which later increased to complete kidney failure. Often, however, a fatal lung failure developed, or the patients died of a multi-organ failure. The relatively high death rate is not unusual for novel viral diseases and can be explained, among other things, by the fact that, on the one hand, this virus is not yet adapted to humans and therefore quickly kills its host instead of using it as a tool to spread, and, on the other hand, human beings have virtually no defenses against this virus subtype. Swine flu, influenza virus H1N1, influenza A virus H1N1A, H1N1 refers to a subtype of influenza A virus genus Alpha influenza virus in the Orthomyxovirus family that is found in ducks, human beings and pigs, but can also infect numerous other mammalian species as well as turkeys. Swine flu, in contrast to swine influenza, refers to an illness in human beings. In 1976, there was a local outbreak of variant A in New Jersey, the one in 1976 among U.S. soldiers at Fort Dix, New Jersey. That pigs were the source of the influenza viruses at Fort Dix is likely, but has never been substantiated. Zika fever, Zika virus, the first major outbreak of Zika fever in human beings in the Yap Islands of Micronesia in 2007, led to the Zika virus being classified as a so-called emergent virus, meaning a pathogen that could potentially spread even further across the world. This was followed by an epidemic in French Polynesia in 2013 to 2014, where an increased incidence of Guillain-Barré syndrome (GBS) was observed for the first time. as well as evidence of transmission to the unborn child. Guillain-Barré syndrome. Guillain-Barré syndrome is an acute neurological clinical picture in which inflammatory changes of the peripheral nervous system occur. The nerve roots arising from the spinal cord polyradiculitis and the associated anterior or proximal nerve sections are mainly affected. The exact cause is not known. In some cases, previous infections and other suspected triggers are held responsible. There can be different courses with varying lengths. GBS can develop from hours or days to months. Guillain-Barré syndrome is characterized by the development of weakness. Paralysis typically develops first in the legs and spreads through the trunk and arms towards the head. The muscles affected first are usually more severely affected than those affected later. Usually, the muscles are symmetrically weakened or paralyzed. Paralysis of the respiratory and swallowing muscles is life-threatening and requires intensive medical therapy. The degree of paralysis is very variable. That is to say, the spectrum ranges from barely noticeable movement restrictions to severe paralysis of large parts of the body. Up to 25% of patients suffer respiratory paralysis and have to be ventilated to maintain life. Many of these patients then suffer from a form of nightmare-zoneroid syndrome. MERS-CoV coronavirus. MERS-CoV Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus is a virus in the coronavirus family first identified in 2012 that can cause severe respiratory infection, pneumonia and kidney failure in human beings. Legionellosis. Bacteria of the genus Legionella. Legionellosis is an infectious disease caused by bacteria of the genus Legionella and can usually be treated well with antibiotics. By far the most common pathogen, 90% to 95% of cases, is Legionella pneumophila. Several forms of legionellosis can be distinguished. The two most important forms are Legionnaire's disease, which is characterized by pneumonia caused by a droplet infection and can take a life-threatening course if left untreated, and the rarer Pontiac fever, which does not cause pneumonia and is usually mild. In rare cases, Legionella can also cause infections such as wound infections, endocarditis, and pyelonephritis. Chikungunya fever. Chikungunya virus. Chikungunya fever is a tropical infectious disease caused by the chikungunya virus chikv, accompanied by fever and joint pain, and transmitted by mosquitoes. The word chikungunya means either bent walker, and originally comes from the Macan language. In German, the disease is also called gebeugter man, bent man. The exact diagnosis can only be made by blood tests. In most people affected, the course of the disease is benign and self-limiting. Permanent damage and death are rare. Ebola fever. Ebola virus. Ebola fever is a zoonosis and is fatal in about 25 to 90% of all cases, depending on the type of virus. Up to now, treatment has been available to combat or alleviate individual symptoms of the disease. Vaccinations are used for prophylaxis. The pathogen can be transmitted to humans from sick human beings through body fluids, from animals including the regionally common bushmeat, and from contaminated objects. In many patients, two clinical phases of the disease can be distinguished, between which the symptoms subside over 24 to 48 hours remission. In the first phase, symptoms occur as in the onset of influenza. The second phase is characterized by hemorrhagic fever. Note, high fever associated with bleeding. Dengue fever, also dandy fever, polka fever, bone-crushing fever, 7-day fever, is a disease whose cause is infection with the dengue virus. The virus is transmitted by the bite of a mosquito and is common in tropical and subtropical areas. The only known hosts of the virus are primates and various mosquito species. The disease often manifests itself with nonspecific symptoms or those resembling a severe flu. However, internal bleeding can also occur. In a severe course of the disease, a so-called dengue hemorrhagic fever (DHF) or dengue shock syndrome (DSS) can occur, both of which can lead to death. Measles virus. Measles is a highly contagious infectious disease that mainly affects children. In addition to the typical red skin spots, measles exanthema, the disease causes fever and a considerably weakened general condition. This so-called children's disease is caused by the measles virus and can be life-threatening in some cases due to severe causes complications, with pneumonia and brain inflammation. A specific therapy does not exist, but the disease, and thus also the complications, can be prevented by vaccination from the age of 12 months. COVID-19 coronavirus. All worth knowing and important information can be found in this volume 18 of the Pleiadian Contact Reports.